My name is Jeremy, and I live in California. Back when I was in 6th grade, I had a close friend. Let's call him Devin. Devin was a super energetic kid, and we would always laugh, joke around, and play ball at recess. Those were some of the best days until Devin, ruined it all. While I had a strong, healthy childhood and a great relationship with my mom and sister, Devin was not as fortunate. His mom was extremely irresponsible. She would frequently expose him to drug use, abusive boyfriends, and other horrific circumstances. Sometime in the month of May during the year this happened, Devin became prone to extreme anger. Every time I tried to approach him, he would always stare at me with the scariest look I had ever seen. One day, Devin never came back from recess. I was in the bathroom later in the day, and it sounded like some kid was laughing in the other stall, and there was lots of loud metallic tapping. I finished quickly and ran out of there. As I was heading back towards the kickball field, something big and hard suddenly hit me in the back of my head. I felt blood trickle down my neck. My vision became blurry, and I fell to the ground, unconscious. When I woke up, I found myself tied to a tree about 50 yards from the play area. My head had stopped bleeding, but was still pounding, and I looked around in a daze trying to figure out what happened and who had done this to me. I tried calling out, "Hey, this isn't funny. My head really hurts. You need to let me go to the nurse's office." "It's all your fault. You've always had the nice life I never did, and I'm going to fix that." The person who walked around from behind the tree to face me turned out to be none other than Devin. I stopped struggling and heaved a sigh of relief, realizing this had to be a bad joke. When I asked him to untie me, he bent over and smiled a deranged, sickly grin. He then proceeded to rant about how much he hated me and was jealous of my life, and how I had a mother who appreciated me and didn't treat me like an inconvenience. It was then he pulled out a kitchen knife he stole from the cafeteria, and I looked on in pure terror as he licked the blade like some kind of fucking psycho. I began struggling with all my might to get free, but he had somehow gotten his hands on the climbing rope from the gym, and there was no way I was going to break free against it. He raised the knife and swung it down quickly, slashing my arm and nicking the rope. I began crying, which only seemed to make him more upset. He threatened that he would hurt me worse if I didn't shut up. I began kicking and thrashing my body weight around in terror, until the tear in the rope loosened enough for me to get free. I rushed Devin and pushed him down, and started running for the cafeteria, screaming my teacher's name at the top of my lungs. As I was running for my life, I could hear Devin about 10 feet behind me, keeping pace with my sprinting. Fortunately, my teacher heard my cries, and she witnessed Devin chasing me into the gym. Once we were indoors around other people, I thought I would be safe, but he lunged at me, and we hit the wood floor hard. My eyes widened, and I suddenly felt time begin to crawl as he put his knee into my back and raised the knife again. In that moment, I thought I would never see my mom or my sister again. But suddenly Devin was grabbed from behind by the gym teacher and restrained. We were then surrounded by kids looking at us dumbfounded. The cut on my arm still bleeding all over the floor. I was taken to the nurse's office and questioned by the police, and Devin was eventually expelled. The school stopped the word about me being attacked from getting out, for fear of bad publicity. I learned from that day that you never truly know someone until you see the hatred in their eyes. I never saw Devin again, but I hope he got the help he needed. This story contains elements of sexual abuse. I'm a 20-year-old woman, and my story takes place when I was about 8 years old in elementary school. I am from Mesa, Arizona, and attended the same school from 1st to 6th grade. In the school I went to, it was a requirement to take music class every year. There was only one music teacher for every grade, and he had been teaching there for many years. He was a middle-aged man, heavy-set, with black and gray hair and a beard to match. I don't remember all the details of every situation that happened with him, since it was about a decade ago, but I do remember some really weird and specific things about him. I remember he was very talented with many instruments, and would often play some of them to impress the class. I also remember we had an activity we would do before class, where he would play music and would have everyone run, skip, and hop around in a circle. He would go around and poke us while we ran around. He would do this thing if you were wearing shorts, a skirt, or ripped jeans with exposed knees. He would come up to you and tickle your knees and squeal, "Naked knees, naked knees." I always hated when he did that. He was my teacher every school year, and even though he always weirded me out, he never gave me that rapey pedo vibe. We had these little plastic recorders we would play sometimes in music class. It's like a small flute. The school provided white recorders for us, but I had my own black recorder at home. So being the unique kid I am, I brought mine in. My teacher was excited to see that I had my own, and even asked if he could see it. When he took it, he started to play on it. Quite skillfully. He handed it back to me, and I noticed it had his spit all over it. So I went to go clean it in the sink, but when I started to go over and wash it, he yelled at me and told me to leave it alone and to sit down. I emphasized that I wanted to clean it off, and again, he told me to leave it. So I refused to play my recorder, and he sent me to the office for not participating. A few years later in the 6th grade, I wanted to play the trumpet, so I decided to join band. And you can probably guess who the band teacher was. There were many occasions where he would pull up my shirt for me and tell me it was a little low cut for a young girl, or would touch my back, or again play my instrument and not want me to clean it afterwards. And if you play brass instruments, you know how gross that is. But I especially recall one incident that happened at band rehearsal. After the class ended, there were only a handful of students left, and a few parents left in the auditorium we practiced in. The teacher asked me to come with him into the music room to help him clean up, bring in chairs, instruments, etc. I brought some chairs into the room and helped put a few things away, but he then asked me if I could stay longer to help him clean up some more, even though everything was pretty much done. I don't really remember anything after that. Nothing at all, actually. I always thought I said no because my parents were here or something, but I honestly don't remember what happened. For years after that, I know I had a lot of issues that young girls shouldn't have. I suddenly became addicted to watching porn on my computer. I would make my dolls have sex with each other. And I started going to therapy after my mom found my Ken doll with the crotch completely melted. I don't remember being molested or raped, but I have read that traumatic memories can sometimes be blocked out and completely forgotten. Fast forward several years later, I got the news that my old music teacher had been arrested for child molestation. A girl I knew from my old band class came forward and said he had molested her in the band room when being asked to help clean. After she spoke up, a few other people came out with more allegations against him as well. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. I have links for the articles about his arrest. The article says attempted molestation, but he was eventually convicted. Mr. Lamanika, I don't know what you may have done to me, but I hope I never see you again. The article mentioned in this story can be found in the description. Keep in mind that I am a female, and this took place when I was 21. This encounter still scares me to this day. I used to work at a Subway, mostly during the night shift, and as some people know, some pretty interesting things are known to happen during the night shift. This particular shift was most definitely the worst. I was working alone during the closing shift one night. This old man who looked to be about 80 years old comes in and starts asking for a meatball sub, but asks in a very heavy Swedish dialect. So obviously I couldn't understand him very well. The language barrier seemed to irritate him, and he attempted to teach me a bit of Swedish for the sake of the order. I tolerated the short lesson and made small talk with him, as it's part of my job, and he pays for a sandwich and leaves. Nothing too bad, right? Wrong. He starts coming in every single night, even on nights that I didn't work, and would always ask for me. If I wasn't there, he would try to get my coworkers to give him my work schedule, and would only ever permit me to make his sandwiches. He would ask my coworkers to text me whenever he felt like telling me at any given moment. They would act like they were doing it. What they were actually doing was texting me that he was there, and that they were getting pretty creeped out. Luckily for me, it was against Subway's policy to hand out people's work schedules or personal info. The instances where I actually was there, he would come in and get the same thing, but started telling me things like how pretty I was, and how if I was just a few years older, I would be his type. He would then proceed to share with me what he did to himself at home, while thinking of me, and the weird things he would do to his sandwich. These miserable attempts at flirting with me would continue for hours, even if I had other customers. Remember, this guy looked like he was over 80 years old. I told my manager about the situation, and she wasn't much help at all. She would just check the camera from her phone every couple of hours while she sat at home to make sure he wasn't bothering other customers, I guess. I eventually went to my area supervisor, and he said if this guy showed up again, I was to call the police. The following night he comes back in, but unfortunately I couldn't get to a phone. He had a crazed look in his eyes, and I was afraid of what might happen if I tried to do anything with him in front of me. So I just made his sandwich and told him that I had other things to do, and he had to leave so I can attend to my duties. He then thankfully left. I told my area supervisor again what happened, and he banned this man from the store. The next week, he comes by right as I'm locking up, and I struggle to hurry with the gate as he's talking to me. At this point, I'm visibly shaking, and I'm hoping he doesn't touch me as he was inches away from my face. He was so close to me that I swear I could smell what he ate the day before. I proceeded to tell him, "You have to leave me alone, sir. You've been banned from the store. If you don't leave, I'm gonna have to call the cops." He glares at me and says, "I see what kind of fucking person you are. You're just a fucking bitch, just like everyone else around here. I thought you were different." By this time, I had fastened the lock shut and started walking away when he shouts, "Oh, by the way, once you're done calling the police, why don't you go ahead and fucking kill yourself?" I ran to the car and called my mom and fiancé and told them what happened. After that, my fiancé walked me to and from my car and sat in the restaurant with me every night. I also started carrying a taser, a pocket knife, and pepper spray to protect myself at work. I won't go anywhere by myself anymore, and anytime I see someone that looks like him, I start to freak out and cry. About 3 months later, I left that job. I was too scared to be left alone anymore. I later found out that not only had he stalked me, but the female workers at Walmart as well. He would find out where their cars were parked and leave things he found in the garbage as gifts, along with creepy-ass love notes. I also found out that he would hop from subway to subway and do this to whatever female worker he chose. I hope I never see him again. Back in 1984, when I was practically still a baby, my parents were having a rough time making ends meet, since my parents thought it would be a genius idea to have 4 kids with no savings to speak of. They couldn't afford an apartment, so we had to move into a local motel with weekly rates. We lived there for about a year. My dad was the only one working, and my older sister was in 2nd grade at the time, so my mom was stuck tending 3 children under the age of 4 for most of the day on her own. I don't remember living there since I was so young, but I was told about the place more once I started growing up, which I assume was a reminder of how far we had come as a family. One morning when Dad was getting ready for work and Mom got my older sister ready for school, Mom noticed a shadow of a man against the pulled curtains of the bedroom. My mom is a notorious scaredy cat, so she hustled my sister toward the bathroom where my dad was, then hissed, "There's someone outside the window." My dad just kinda rolled his eyes at her, but looked out toward the front anyway to see if he could see anything. When he saw the shadow, his attitude changed. He snuck quietly, but quickly across the room and opened the door. The man who had been standing outside the window immediately turned and ran off away from the motel into the street blindly. My dad narrowed his eyes at this retreating man and then closed the door, figuring if the guy was violent he would have started some shit instead of running away. He advised Mom to keep the curtains closed over the window and to stay home with the door locked until he got back later. Mom didn't want my dad to leave, but Dad reminded her that he had to, or else he wouldn't get paid for the day. So Mom reluctantly agreed and sent Dad and sister on their way. Later that afternoon, I was being an annoying little crybaby, so Mom instructed my older brother to play quietly with my younger sister and watch Sesame Street a while she tried to soothe me into a nap on the couch. My mom was sitting on the couch, patting my back, while I bawled my eyes out for no reason, when she glanced at the front window to see if there was anyone there. Sure enough, there was. My mother freaked out, snatching me up from the couch, which caused me to cry even harder than I already was. She locked the three of us in the bathroom, so she could call Dad at work, and then locked herself in with us. My dad skipped out of work and ran back home. When he got there, the guy was still standing at our window, with his hands cupped around his face, like he was trying to get a better look through the gap in the curtains. But my dad didn't even give the guy a warning. He just punched him in the head as soon as he got close enough. The guy stumbled away from the window in a daze, and Dad slapped him around, all the while yelling things like, "You think it's okay to scare people? You think it's okay to scare my wife and my kids? I'll show you what happens to fuckers who creep around windows." My dad hit him a few more times before the motel manager showed up and stopped him, thinking my dad was just beating up some random guy. The window creeper got away during the confusion, and he never came back. This story is told from the perspective of a female. I'm 33 years old, but this story took place when I was 18. I had this friend named Javier who lived across the street from my apartment building. We hung out a lot, and through him I met a guy named Jake. At first he came off as very charming, and we began dating. But after a short while I realized his sweet attitude was just a facade, and that he was a bit of a pothead. He also became violently jealous if he thought other guys were looking at me, and even told me that I wasn't allowed to go to the club because he didn't want guys hitting on me. Eventually he started harassing me for money to buy pot. He had never laid a hand on me until one day when he demanded money from me and I refused. Usually he would just whine like a little bratty child for hours until I relented and gave him cash to shut him up. But this time he decided to slam my head against the air conditioner in his room. I shoved him off and walked past him and out of his apartment, telling him that we were through. I was secretly relieved he had given me a reason to finally end it, because now I could go hang out at the club again with my friends. Skip ahead to that weekend, and I'm at the club. Jake shows up to harass me about breaking up with him. The bouncer noticed him and threw him out after Jake made a pitiful attempt to fight back. Every weekend after that, he tried getting back into the club, but was never allowed in. I heard through a male friend of mine that he was spreading rumors that I had an STD, and also asked a guy that I knew to hack into my computer and plant a virus. Then one weekend, this guy that I didn't know came up to me in the club and told me that Jake had given him a knife outside and told him to go inside and stab me because nobody leaves him. I should have called the cops, but I didn't, mostly because I was young and foolish and was determined not to be intimidated by him. I made sure my male friends would walk or drive me home and watch my back. Skip ahead a few months, and Jake disappears. Just like that, I stopped being harassed by him with no explanation, and I'm thrilled. I eventually hear through my friend Javier that he's been arrested. Apparently he and his friend had beaten a guy into a coma with a skateboard. Skip ahead 10 years later. I get a message on Facebook from him telling me that he's out of prison and asked me to get back together with him. He sees that I'm now married with kids, but regardless says that I should leave my husband to be with him, that he would take care of me and my kids. I thought, you think I would leave my husband for a crazy convict stalker? He tells me how his mother died and left him a place in Manhattan and that I should come live with him. And then without pausing to breathe, he asked me for nudes. Then I immediately blocked him. About 2 years later, my good friend Javier went missing in the Bronx. After leaving his brother's house, a few weeks later they found his body in the river. As far as I know, they never found out who killed him. Jake may have had nothing to do with it, but he's the only violent person I knew that Javier hung out with. Sadly, Javier left a daughter behind, who now has no dad. As far as I know, Jake is still wandering the streets of New York City. I've attached a link to a New York Post article reporting about the skateboard attack. I'm going to start this by saying I'm a pretty big nerd when it comes to anime. So naturally I love attending conventions while cosplaying. My husband and I had recently attended an anime convention, but unfortunately my experience was ruined when I encountered someone I had hoped to never see again. Thank God he didn't recognize me, but regardless, it brought back an awful memory I had managed to bury deep within my subconscious. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time of this chilling event, I was 15, and my friends and I were attending our very first convention. It was smaller than average, I suppose, but we didn't mind. We were just happy to take part in the experience. And while we met some great people, there was one person I had a confrontation with that will forever be burned into my memory. We decided on the first day of the convention to make sure and coordinate our cosplay outfits. We decided to dress up as Vocaloids, which are a group of anime hipster characters based of different tech software companies. No joke, Google them. So we were there exploring, taking pictures, and having a good time when we see someone dressed as a fellow Vocaloid. Thinking, what are the chances? We decided to ask him if he would mind taking some pictures with us. He agreed with a good-natured smile, and we had someone take a few group pictures of us all together. Afterwards, we made some small talk with him, and he introduced himself as Patrick, and that he would introduce us to some other cosplay enthusiasts. We agreed because why not? That was kind of in the spirit of why we were all there. We met up with Patrick's friends shortly after, and they informed us that there would be a party in their hotel room later on, and that we were all invited. We reluctantly explained to them that we were underage. Patrick's friends then apologized for the misunderstanding, and told us that we would see them around the convention, and to have fun and stay safe. It seemed like they had a hard time convincing Patrick to leave with them, as he seemed to want to linger and talk to us, but eventually he begrudgingly made to leave our group and join his friends at their insistence. We told him goodbye, and that we would probably catch up with him tomorrow. It was getting late anyway, and what panels were still open were strictly 18 and older audiences. Patrick shrugged. Well, it's not like any of you haven't seen hentai before, so having an age limit is pretty much bullshit. He offered to buy us hentai books from the vendors if we decided we wanted some. We all were more embarrassed than flattered. He had a point, given that we all had experienced hentai graphic novels at some point. We told him goodnight, and we went back to our room without really fixating much on him. The next day we got an early start, and dressed up in different cosplay outfits. I decided to dress up as Lolita for the day. We bumped into Patrick downstairs, and he injected himself into our group again. We all were having such a good time that it took me a while to realize that he was constantly staring right at me, and not in a shy, subtle way either. Thinking that the bow of my outfit was crooked or my contacts were messed up, and I asked him if something was wrong with how I looked. He replied almost too quickly, "No, I guess I forgot to mention to you ladies that I'm a Lolicon fan, and you just look really cute." I felt myself blush and wondered just how hard of a Lolicon fan he was, or was he the type that looks at Lolita-themed porn? I eventually tried to brush off his statement and have some fun. After a short while, we made our way down to the vendors, and I ended up getting separated from my friends and found myself alone with Patrick. Suddenly feeling very vulnerable, I pulled out my phone to call my friends so we could regroup, when I realized my phone is dead. Swallowing my pride, I reluctantly asked him if I could borrow his. He told me his phone was up in his hotel room, and if I didn't mind, we could go up there together and get it. I replied I would just go back to my own room and plug in my phone instead. He seemed kinda irritated by my apprehension, and insisted that it would be quicker just to get the phone from his room. Being the dumb and trusting girl that I was at the time, I gave in, and we headed up to the room. On the way up, he started telling me about this hentai comic he read about an elementary school girl who lies to a lonely blind man about her age, telling him that she's in high school and willingly has sex with him, and they develop feelings for each other. I'm more than slightly creeped out by that. But it only got worse when he proceeded to tell me that he really got turned on by a certain scene involving the character I'm dressed up as in her comic, and wouldn't it be great if I could reenact it for him? Before I could think of an excuse to separate myself from him, we were outside his room. I told him that I would wait outside while he grabbed his phone, but he insisted on me coming into the room. Because it would only be a minute, it was easier just to accept than to argue, so I went in and stood right next to the door, while he went over to his bag on the bed and began digging around inside. While he was preoccupied, my eyes wandered around the room, trying to find anything I could use as a weapon should I need one. I noticed a charger hanging out of a wall outlet, and I grabbed it. I figured I would lock myself in the bathroom, plug my phone in, and call for help. I told him that while he searched, I would use the restroom, and that I would be right back out. He then turned and looked at me with the most sadistic look I had ever seen, and asked me if I would just rather use him as a toilet instead. Without thinking twice, I sprinted out of there and back to my own hotel room. When I reached the room, my friends were already there waiting for me. They figured that my phone had died and that I would make my way back to charge it. I explained to them what happened and told them to avoid Patrick at all costs. We hung out in our room for a while to calm down and avoid bumping into Patrick for as long as possible. We eventually left the room a few hours later, sticking together as a tight-knit group, and eventually encountered Patrick's group of friends from the day before. When they asked us if we had seen Patrick recently, we lied and told them no. One of the women in the group informed us that we should steer clear of him because he seemed to have an unhealthy interest in young girls. We asked them why they were at the convention with him if he gave off bad vibes. They told us that they had been friends with him for a while and liked to keep an eye on him as best they could to prevent him from trying anything, but he would occasionally slip away. Out of sheer embarrassment, I didn't say anything to them about what happened. This guy Patrick apparently still goes to conventions in my state. I know this because my husband and I had bumped into him last year. I was relieved when he either didn't recognize me or didn't approach me due to my husband being with me. Either way, Patrick, I hope you haven't successfully baited any other girls into your room. I've never shared this story with anyone outside my immediate family. It may sound insane, but I promise it's the absolute truth. When I was 15, my parents and I moved to a newly constructed housing development in Beltsville, Maryland. We lived right on the end of a cul-de-sac, but our house was the only one that was completed. Granted, our lawn was just one giant patch of dirt, but we didn't mind. We loved the experience of living in a brand new house in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. All of the other houses around us still needed the finishing touches put on, such as windows and siding, so none of them were occupied. During the day, there were contractors all over the other properties hard at work, but at night, it was nice and quiet, and my parents and I would take long walks around the area and sneak peeks at the inside of the other empty houses. About a week after we moved in, I woke up at around 2 a.m. from an awful pain in my foot that turned out to be an ingrowing toenail. But I didn't know that at the time. I limped downstairs trying to find my Game Boy because I figured if I was going to stay awake and miserable, I might as well play some Pokemon Blue to make the time pass. I didn't turn on any lights on my way downstairs, and I found the Game Boy on the coffee table by the light of the street lamps outside. I walked back past the front door to head back upstairs when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye and paused. Next to our front door, we had a long window that gave us a perfect view of our porch outside and the driveway beyond. My mom had intended to put up a curtain, but hadn't got around to it yet. I stopped in my tracks and turned to look outside, and after squinting for a few seconds, my heart began to hammer inside my chest, and I'm sure my eyes went as big as stop signs. In the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. The only light I had to judge by was the street lamp at the end of the driveway, but there looked to be a figure of a man standing with his back to me, literally just off our porch, as if he had just stepped off of it. He seemed to be staring in the direction of the empty house across the street. That was scary enough, but what terrified me even more was how dead still he was standing. He wasn't even shifting his weight or fidgeting in any way I could make out. I blinked hard and tried to tell myself I was just seeing things, that it was a shadow or just my imagination. But when I opened my eyes again, I realized I wasn't crazy. The figure was definitely there. I should have cautiously made my way back upstairs and woke up my parents, but instead I did something very stupid. I'm not sure why I did it. I guess some part of me just wanted to try to make out if he was breathing, and I moved closer to the window and practically pressed my face to the glass. That's when the figure either heard me or felt my eyes on him, and his head spun around to face me, not his upper body. Just his head jerking around to look over his shoulder, almost like an animal. In that moment, I saw 2 pale pinpricks of light staring directly back at me, and I just knew they were his eyes. I launched myself back from the window and screamed for my parents. I practically flew up the stairs and started wailing that there was a man on the front porch. My parents don't believe in guns, so when my dad saw the terror on my face, he grabbed the closest heavy object within reach, which happened to be a metal tubing attachment from the vacuum cleaner. He then made his way down the stairs. As I threw myself into my mom's arms, I heard my dad cursing and hollering. Then there was a moment of silence. We heard my dad drop the pipe, and when he called upstairs to my mom, his voice was terrified and desperate. "Call the cops! Do it now!" Now, my dad is a big guy, 6'4", and at the time easily 250. And back when I was a baby, he used to work part-time as a bouncer. But in that moment, he sounded frightened in a way I never thought possible. There came a hard pounding from outside the front door. I hid in my parents' closet while my mom called the cops. My dad was halfway up the stairs yelling at the guy just to leave, and that the police were coming. After what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably closer to 3, the pounding stopped. The police arrived maybe 10 minutes later and searched the entire property and the surrounding houses, but they couldn't find the man. I stayed upstairs while my mom and dad spoke to the officers in the driveway. The police did routine drive-bys for the next several nights, but as far as I know, they never found the man. I didn't get a good night's sleep for weeks. I kept remembering how the man's head had snapped around to face me, those pale eyes burning themselves permanently into my mind. It was several weeks later that my dad finally told me what scared him so much. When he had reached the bottom of the stairs, the man had his face pressed up to the window, and the knife was between his teeth. My dad dropped the vacuum pipe when he saw the tip of the knife impaled through the man's cheek. The man had then started tracing his blood against the outside of the window with his finger. After the police had arrived, they noticed streaks of blood all around the siding of our house, as if he had encircled it, continuing to run his bloody fingers across the outer walls. My family never took walks at night again, even after the other houses were eventually occupied, and to this day, I never ever peek out through the curtains at night, for fear I may see those eyes again. My story takes place in Lancaster, California back in 2007. I was 18 at the time and a senior in high school. I had picked up a job as a sign waver. You know, those people who stand outside on street corners waving promotional signs for businesses. Yeah, it sucks about as much as you think it does, but as a high school student it paid fairly well. By the way, please stop throwing things at us from your cars while we're waving our signs. It's just not cool. The job is demeaning enough without having fast food launched at our heads. Anyway, I had been standing on my corner for about 2 hours swinging my sign around and waving at passing drivers, when I noticed this bald guy sitting across the street from me on a bench looking my way. I waved to him more or less just to keep my rhythm going, and he immediately gave me the finger. It wasn't just a casual flip-off either. He raised his fist like he wanted to hit me and started shouting at me from across the intersection. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but the word faggot was definitely used at least once. I avoided eye contact with him and focused my attention on the cars again. Soon after, my boss pulled up to the curb and told me that I was free to leave as our company got laid off and all the sign waivers were going to be replaced by a different team. I was disappointed that I would be out of work for the foreseeable future, but in that moment I was relieved to be able to sit down somewhere out of the sun. I was about to tell my boss about the bald guy when I noticed that the bench across the street was empty. I'm not sure when he had left, but I simply shrugged it off and got into the car with my boss, who told me that my replacement was going to be there within an hour. Over the course of the next hour, I went home, got changed, and was meeting a friend for lunch before going to see a movie when the notifications on my phone started exploding non-stop, with people asking me if I was alright and to please call them. I was confused and immediately called my mom, who started crying when she heard my voice. I went home to be with her and immediately found out what all the concern had been about. The news was reporting that a sign waver had just been shot dead on the very corner I had been standing on less than an hour ago. When the victim had fallen, his sign had partially covered his face, and he hadn't had any identification on him. So most of my friends had jumped to the horrible conclusion that it was me lying there. The creepy thing was that the victim and I looked very similar. We were both Latino with short dark hair. We were about the same height, and even had been wearing nearly identical outfits. I was eventually interviewed by the police, and I mentioned the bald man who had been shouting angrily at me from across the street. But to the best of my knowledge, they concluded that the shooting was gang-related. Either way, the situation shook me, and I didn't feel safe or relaxed for a long while afterwards. I felt terrible that the other guy died, but at the same time, had my boss not come and picked me up when he did, who knows if it would have been me who was shot and killed. I have a wife and child now, and sometimes when I look at them, I think about how different everything could have been. I'm 17. I live in the city of Estonia in Europe. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any mistakes. It was 2 p.m., and I had just finished another boring school day. I had guitar lessons on Wednesday after school. I considered skipping the lesson and going back home, and lying to my parents that the teacher was sick and that there was no lesson today. But I decided to man up and just go to class anyway. That turned out to be a big mistake. I got to the entrance of the building, and I spotted a weird homeless guy wearing a red hooded jacket sitting cross-legged in a puddle in the middle of the parking lot. I stopped and stared at him for about a minute in confused fascination, but he didn't move once. It had rained the night before, and there were dozens of small puddles scattered around the parked cars, but it looked like he had intentionally gone out of his way to find the largest one in the lot to occupy. There were a couple of other people giving him sideways glances as they entered the building, but no one was saying anything. So I eventually just shrugged and made my way to my lesson. After 2.5 hours of sitting in the classroom, I had completely forgotten about him. As I left the building, I noticed to my surprise, the man was still sitting there, and he hadn't moved a muscle. I was very creeped out, and I did something very stupid. I walked over to him, and once I got within 10 feet, I pulled out my phone, and like a smartass I said, "Hey man, don't move." I took a photo of him. I have since lost the photo because I had to change phones. After I took the picture, the guy made eye contact with me, and my heart skipped a beat. His head didn't move, just his eyes. The man's skin was extremely wrinkled and weather-beaten. His eyes were gray, and he had an incredibly long, unkempt beard, and he smelled like he had been living in a heap of garbage. His looks added to the way he was behaving, and it sent a chill up my spine. It was like he wasn't even human. I immediately took off at a brisk walk towards the sidewalk, not letting myself look back. I crossed the street and stopped at the opposite crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, my guitar case feeling twice as heavy as it usually did. I glanced back towards the parking lot, and my heart sank. The puddle man had stood up and was walking directly towards me. His eyes were staring at me intensely, and he didn't even bother to look both ways before he started crossing the street. I immediately called out an apology to him in Estonian, and again in Russian, but his expression didn't change. It was then I noticed that his clothes were dripping wet from sitting in the puddle, but it wasn't just a trail of water he was leaving behind him. He was bleeding heavily from both hands, or possibly his wrists. It was hard to tell, and he was leaving dark red pools on the concrete as he continued to walk towards me. I immediately dashed across the crosswalk without waiting for the light to change. In retrospect, I'm actually pretty lucky I didn't get hit by a car. I started running as fast as I could down the sidewalk without looking back. I know I should have just probably called the cops, but I was panicking and holding onto my guitar case with both hands. I didn't want to free one of my hands to use my phone for fear that it might slow me down. Every so often I would glance behind me and notice that the guy was still following me with long, determined strides. After about 5 minutes of running, lugging my guitar, I felt like I was going to collapse, but I still had another half-mile to go before I reached my apartment building, and the puddle man was closing in on me. Knowing that I was going to regret it later, I dropped the case on the sidewalk and just sprinted forward down the dark street as fast as I could go. I didn't look back. Once I got to my building, I ran up the stairs, down the hall, and ducked into my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I was gasping for air like I had nearly drowned, and my mother yelled at me from the kitchen for making so much noise. She asked me if I was okay, and I just nodded without responding. I don't know why I didn't tell her what happened, probably because she wouldn't have believed me and would have screamed at me for abandoning my guitar and would have made me go back to retrieve it. I simply told her that I left my guitar at school overnight and locked myself in my room until I was finally able to relax. The following morning, I woke up at 6 to walk the dog and to get ready for school. This is the part I'm sure people are not going to believe, but I promise you it's the truth. When I opened my apartment door, I gasped and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. My guitar case was sitting just outside the door and had dried, crusted blood all over the handle. That was terrifying enough, but what freaked me out even more was the outside doorknob was covered in dried blood as well. My guitar case doesn't have a tag or anything on it with my name or address. I have absolutely no idea how he found out where I lived. I immediately washed the blood off the knob and the handle, and I never told anyone, not the school, not the police, and definitely not my parents. I stopped going to my guitar lessons after that. I haven't seen the puddle man since, but sometimes I lie awake at night in fear, knowing that he knows where I live and that he's already tried to get in once. Thank God I locked the door that night. 4 years ago, I was finally able to move to a big city, one I had wanted to live in all my life. I had just turned 23, had a well-paying job, and many of my friends already lived there. I rented out a shabby studio apartment and got myself a cat. I was absolutely in love with the city, for a while. It all started at a punk show in an unkept dive bar, penis doodles on the walls, sticker toilets, my natural habitat. I had been drinking heavily and got very sociable, made the rounds to greet my group of friends, got free birthday beers, and had a great time. I stood right at the stage for most of the show because the band was genuinely amazing. It took me a while to notice the tall skinhead guy standing about 5 feet from me. He was very tall, not fat or skinny. Maybe broad is the right word. He had a shaven head, boots and braces and all that. I didn't pay much attention to him as I was focused on the band. During my cigarette breaks and while watching the band, I noticed he was always sort of nearby, but I assumed he must be socializing with common friends. At one point I was standing in front of the stage, and a mosh pit had formed behind me. He was in it, and whenever he circled back around me, he would sort of shove me, attempting to get me in the pit, but I didn't join because I was wasted and knew I would get hurt if I did. The show ended and everyone was saying their goodbyes when I realized I lost my bus pass. It was too far to walk home, and none of my friends would let me crash at their place. I was in the middle of begging my friends for a ride or bus money when the skinhead guy approached me saying that he could drive me home. He was clearly intoxicated, and I knew I shouldn't ride with a drunk driver, but so was I, and it was raining, and I never made the best decisions. While in the car, I got my first good look at his face. He wasn't ugly, but it looked like he could pass for 35 or 40. He drove surprisingly well and got me home safe. At the apartments, he asked if he could hang out inside. I told him no, that my cat doesn't like strangers. He seemed fine with it and told me goodnight and left. Exactly 1 week later, I discovered flowers at my front door. There was no indication of who had sent them, but I hate flowers, so I threw them away. A few weeks later, he called me. Apparently, he got my number from a friend. He asked me if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend. I was really creeped out by this. I wasn't used to men hitting on me or being so direct. I declined, saying that I had to work that weekend, which wasn't true. That weekend, I went to a house show. There were no other skinheads attending this show, so I thought he wouldn't be there. But of course he was. I avoided him for most of the night and tried having a good time. When I realized this guy had done nothing wrong to me, he had been nothing but nice and helpful, he just had a crush. So why was I being so cold to him and getting so creeped out? I decided to say hi to him and be friendly. He acted friendly back, and we shared some whiskey and chatted. At one point he put his arm around my waist, and people teased us for looking so sappy. Around 3 a.m. the party died down, and everyone either left or passed out around the house. I was outside smoking on the front curb when he came out and bummed a smoke off me. He seemed kind of angry with me out of nowhere and started going off on me for lying about having to work that day and refusing dinner. He accused me of being a tease. His outburst was so sudden and unprovoked, he caught me off guard, as he had been so nice just a while ago. I tried telling him I took the day off, but he didn't believe me. He asked me if I liked him. At this point, I started to realize how unhinged he was. I told him I did. Now keep in mind, I was drunk, and I said this attempting to avoid a physical confrontation. This was a terrible mistake. He grabbed my arm and started towards his car, saying that if I really liked him, I would come to his car and fuck him. I tried pulling away and yelled something like, "You leave me the fuck alone." When I turned to go back inside, he grabbed the back of my hair and slammed me to the ground. My head hit the pavement really hard. I couldn't comprehend anything for a while. I remember him above me yelling, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I only remember just lying there, not moving or saying anything or screaming. But apparently I had been screaming, loud enough to wake up most of the people in the house. They told me later that they ran out to see what all the commotion was about and saw me lying in the road screaming. He was beating up on me. I have no recollection of the beating. They chased after him, but he got in his car and drove off. They took me to the hospital where I had to get 5 stitches on my head and had a broken nose. I was released 2 days later when they confirmed I didn't have a concussion. After my release, I learned more about this guy from my friends. Apparently he had been telling people we hooked up that night he gave me a ride home, and led people to believe that we were seeing each other since then. His roommates told me that he would leave, claiming that he was hanging out at my place, and returned early the mornings after. He never did show up to my house, as far as I know, but possibly stalked the place at night. These same roommates of his assured me that they took care of him, and he jumped states before I was even released from the hospital. He hasn't tried contacting me again since. It took me months to heal physically, and I've become very paranoid and very untrusting towards nearly everyone. I lost many friends because of what happened, and a lot of people didn't believe me, except for the ones who helped me out that night, and the guy's roommates that ran him out of state. They've become very close friends with me and helped me get through this ordeal. I don't live in the city anymore, and I really miss it sometimes, but I feel much safer in my small town. When I was a kid, my dad and I moved in with my grandparents for a while. My grandparents' house was very large and in the middle of nowhere. The entire house was built out of wood and sheetrock, so the outside was this dark wooden color, and so were the areas that hadn't been covered with sheetrock as a design quirk. Everything was always creaking as the house was very old, and every single decoration that my grandparents had looked like it belonged in a museum. My room was in the basement, which in this house wasn't completely below ground, so the windows in my bedroom faced out into the wide open backyard. Like I said, this house was in the middle of nowhere, so when it got dark, it got really dark. There were trees surrounding the house on all sides, as the driveway wasn't even a straight path. It curved through the surrounding forest before meeting the main road. I was home alone frequently, as my dad worked and my grandparents liked to go out. So without even having any pets in the house, when I was left alone, I was isolated. I was probably the only person around for miles. My bedroom in the basement happened to share a wall with the laundry room, but the laundry room was only accessible if you walked out of my room, up the stairs towards the front door, turned right, went down the second set of stairs, and walked down into another basement area that wasn't connected to my section of the basement. I know, it was a pretty weird design. That section of basement had a side door that opened up into the side of an attached shed. A lot of times when my dad came home, he forgot to lock the door behind him, because it was kind of a door within a hall really, if you count the shed. Anyway, despite the laundry room being literally right there, it was still a long walk from my bedroom. Whenever people would do laundry, I would hear them climbing up the creaky steps and slamming the door of the dryer, etc. One day I was home alone after school, and I was sitting on the couch drawing, when I heard someone knock on the front door. I peered out the window to see someone standing there. Me being 15, I thought I was old enough to be an adult. I got up and went to go answer the door. The door had large glass windows on either side of it, so I could easily see who was outside. There was a man standing there. He was a Caucasian male, had a large beard with brown messy hair. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and overalls, and literally looked like a lumberjack. Thanks to the windows, I could see him as easily as he could see me. I was going to open the door, but then he stepped up to the window so quickly that I froze. I just stood there while he waited, almost like he was expecting something. It was then I decided not to open the door. Hi, I called out hesitantly.
Hey.
He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud.
Is Mary home?
Mary was my grandmother's name, but most people who knew her well called her Mary Lou. I stared at him through the glass, not knowing what to say.
I think I got her mail by accident. Could she come to the door so I can talk to her?
They're not home, I replied stupidly. The man smiled.
And they left a pretty young thing like you home alone?
I didn't say anything for a moment and then pointed to the bench on the porch. If you want, you can leave the mail on the bench, and I'll let them know you stopped by. The man stared back at me in dismay, but finally nodded.
Okay. You have a good day.
Later I found out it was only a piece of junk mail. I told my grandparents about the man when they got home, and they told me they had no idea who it could have been. So a few weeks passed, and I had pretty much forgotten about the man. Aside from drawing, my hobby was polishing long branches that I found in the forest, and made staffs out of them. I would spend a lot of time in the woods listening to music and twirling the staffs in my hands, and teaching myself how to toss them and catch them like batons. I got pretty good at it after a while. One day I was outside doing this when that same man approached me. He had crossed our backyard and walked right up to me. I had my headphones in so I didn't hear him coming. I nearly screamed when I turned around and saw him standing beside me, practically within arm's reach. He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud again, and reminded me that he was my neighbor and he had seen me from his section of the woods and wanted to ask me about my staff. I pretty much just shut down and refused to answer any of his questions, with anything more than shrugs and grunts. What was really bothering me was that I knew there was no one within eyeshot that could have seen me that wasn't on our own property. The nearest house was several miles away. I made an excuse about having to go back inside, and I went through the shed entrance, which in hindsight was a really stupid thing to do. From back inside the house, I watched him saunter off into the woods. I didn't even feel bad for blowing him off. This guy had no business walking into our section of the woods and approaching a teenage girl. Several weeks later, I was home alone again, and I was drawing on my computer in my room when I heard the bottom two stairs creak from the other side of the wall, where the laundry room was. I froze, wondering who it possibly could be. I hadn't heard the front door open upstairs, and it was too early for my dad to be home. Starting to panic, I left my room and hid in the storage closet under my section of stairs. I used my phone as a light and crammed myself in between two boxes. I pressed myself down as far as I could. I was horrified to hear the laundry room steps continue to creak. Even though I was in the next room over, something in my gut told me it wasn't my dad, because he wouldn't be climbing the stairs so slowly and carefully. I waited holding my breath as I could hear the ceiling above me creak. The footsteps slowed and then backtracked, as though the intruder was trying to figure out the strange layout of the house. Then I heard the stairs above me begin to creak. I panicked as I realized whoever it was had found their way into the section of basement where I was hiding. Suddenly I heard the footsteps quicken and the front door was opened and then shut. A few minutes later I heard my grandparents walk inside. The man had pretended to wait at the front door for them, and my grandparents didn't even notice that the front door was unlocked. I cautiously got out of the storage area and stood at the base of the stairs, mostly hidden behind the corner, just peeking out to see what was going on. But he saw me. He waved and grinned at me like he was my friendly uncle. I did not wave back. He was acting friendly and confident, not at all like a man who was just almost caught for breaking and entering. We moved a short while later, and thankfully my grandparents have never heard from him since. I was in 5th grade when this happened. My brother is 3 years older than me, so he was in 8th grade at the time. I'm now 24 and he's 27. We lived on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere surrounded by trees, with my grandparents' house 30 feet across the yard. My dad's job used to require him to work 12-hour shifts. This incident happened when he was working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was only me, my brother, and my mother at home. My grandparents were at their house across the yard as well. It was probably around 9 p.m., and we were sitting in the living room watching some TV before heading to bed. From the living room window, you can see my grandparents' house clearly, as well as the dirt road behind it, so you can see a car's headlights before you see the actual car. While watching TV, I happened to turn my head and notice headlights coming from down the road. As the car came into view, I noticed it began to slow down. I expected my fear to be alleviated when I saw the car continue to roll past the house, but it didn't. The headlights just barely managed to shine past the corner of the house, so I could tell that the car had come to a complete stop out front. I told my brother and my mother what I saw, and they came to the window to witness it themselves. My mom told us not to panic. It may just be somebody needing directions. Of course, I didn't think of this at the time, but what person drives down a dirt road, needing directions at this time of night? We all waited at the window for what seemed like the longest few minutes of my life, and my imagination was going wild with horrible scenarios that my grandparents were possibly facing. Finally, the car came into view past my grandparents' house, and within a few seconds it disappeared down the road. About a minute later, our house phone rang, and my mother picked up. It was my grandmother on the other end. She said that some truck had stopped in front of their house, and a shirtless man had knocked on their front door. My grandmother, who had answered the door, called my grandfather over to her and asked the man if they could do something for him. The man said that he needed my grandfather to give him a ride somewhere up the road. This request was extremely odd because there was someone else sitting in the driver's seat of the truck. My grandfather declined his request because of there already being somebody with the man, and he couldn't imagine why the man needed a ride specifically from him. There was a screen door separating them from the man, and after my grandfather declined his request, he became visibly angry and started yelling while beating on the steel part of the screen door. My grandparents closed the heavier wooden door in front of the man's face and watched him from the window until he got back in the truck and left. After my mother had gotten off the phone, she called my dad and explained everything to him. Being that he works a good hour and 10 minutes away, and the fact that nobody was threatened with a weapon, he just told my mom to call the cops and have them check out the woods around the houses, just to be sure the man and his companion weren't trying to stake us out. We knew a cop that went to the same church as us. He came shortly after and brought another policeman with him. They drove both of their patrol cars up to the tree line and shined their huge spotlights into the woods. After he and the other cop had done a thorough sweep of the property, they reported that they found nothing suspicious and told us to call them if we heard anything else. After the cops left, my mom called my dad back and told him that everything seemed to be okay. However, the next morning, when my mom was taking me and my brother to school, we were driving in the opposite way which the truck had gone the night before. We hadn't even traveled a mile before we saw something strange. There was a black knit cap, along with a shirt and a pair of pants and shoes lying on the side of the road, and they looked as if they had been taken off in a hurry. By the time we came home from school, the clothing was gone. Nothing ever showed up on the news, and the cops said they hadn't seen or heard anything about it either. It's been 15 years since that happened, and to this very day, I'm still left wondering what would have happened if my grandfather had agreed to give the shirtless man a lift to God knows where. This story is told from the point of view of a female. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though I was sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss a few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. I had to park on the street because the apartment complex had limited parking, and they told me to watch out for the neighborhood creep. His name was George, and he was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge. He looked very intimidating. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man to make a show of being in their place, a brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what the man was to the woman or what they looked like, George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall and very intimidating, I felt confident that I would be alright, and for a time, I was. It started about 6 months after we moved in. My stepmom and my dad were fighting a lot, and they eventually separated. One night I was sitting on the porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just ended up looking up when I felt a bug on me or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors, and then I played video games in my room. I told myself that I was probably just being paranoid. The next morning, I got up for a cigarette and some coffee. Lo and behold, only a few minutes after I got onto the porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I finished off my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I would smoke. If my dad was with me, George wouldn't so much as peek his head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call the police about George, but he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly began to escalate. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot, so I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of these paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree, and you can see about 90% of their body. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight before in my life. It was around this time, I believe, my mother was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything with my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George got closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone would call 911 for me if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall, so I would be out of sight when I smoked, but I would angle myself so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of me being kidnapped, raped, and murdered began to invade my dreams every night. One day I was gossiping with my neighbor. "Did you hear about George?" "No, what about him?" "He got arrested last night." In the parking lot of the complex, there's this big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height. It's perhaps maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady and her kid were walking by and saw George sitting on the box, masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him? It kind of makes me want to puke, but also scares me at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night, he got braver. It was about maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. He went back to chatting with the neighbor. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard my neighbor shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing. It's a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else until she burst into my room in a panic. Her eyes were huge. She hopped from one foot to the other frantically, like she was doing some kind of dance. "He's bleeding." "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "It's your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of my guild. I grabbed our little first aid kit and filled it with band-aids. I thought in my mind that Dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his knife and trying to catch it, but when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with the real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including my neighbor Shell, who was the one who came in and told me, and my neighbor Caleb, who was holding a shirt to my dad's side. My dad was facing away from me, and his entire back was covered in blood. It was like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. I didn't know that we had bears in this city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel kinda queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person to turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all the adults around me were panicked, aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch, and I told Shell where we keep our towels. She then rushed inside to go grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned around to look at me like they've never heard of 911 before. "No!" my dad shouted. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." I dialed 911 and relayed our address and the reason for the emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone ran and got him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and to show them what house George lived in, and then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly and I wanted to scream at them. "Run! My dad is bleeding out and you don't care?" I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound. They got my dad packed into an ambulance. I was about to jump in when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his algaes and whatnot for the paramedics. It's 2 years later, and all these memories are still burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for about 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmother's message. That's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried on forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something. But he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get me away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, there were 14 cops. He still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I've never felt before in my life. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw George staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from looking at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back into my house, where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered this story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George shouted back at him while I was in the house.
"Come tell me that to my face like a man."
So my dad hopped over the porch and walked up to him. This creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, and then got my dad in the back with the knife. He missed his kidney very, very narrowly. The knife traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize that he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him. Thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney, George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighbor stalker put his hands up and went back into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when one of my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about what happened to my dad. Throughout the week while I was on the porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and they were now certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women had George stalk them up to their apartment door, and he would pull his pants down demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of these days, one of my neighbors came up to me and told me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that maybe one day he had planned to grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took that self-defense course and learned how to fight like my dad, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider. So, there's that. My dad is doing okay now. He recently just had his 3rd surgery to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be the last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, perhaps I would have been the first victim George stabbed. For about 7 years in my early 20s, I worked as support staff for a company that provided residential services to people with mental disabilities. It was a pretty cool job until this occurrence. The house I worked in was dedicated to the care of 14 to 18-year-old boys. We often would receive different clients who would stay with us for any length of time, short-term and some very long-term. Jeffrey was a 15-year-old autistic teenager. He was a great kid. I never had any problems working with him or any issues with his behavior. His parents simply weren't well equipped enough at home to provide the care he needed. His family, meaning his mother, father, and sister, would come to visit just about every weekend, which was nice, considering some parents dropped off their children and would never return. Jeffrey's sister was also disabled, but not as severely as her brother. We'll call her Sally. Sally was 20 years old, at least 230 pounds, and more often than not reeked of body odor. She wore dirty clothes, had long greasy hair, and had a face covered with acne and scars. Sally would always watch me whenever they visited. Not just watch me work, but would watch every move I made. She often tried to flirt, and it made me extremely uncomfortable, but I would usually just ignore it, as she was a family member of one of our patients, and she wasn't really doing anything wrong. After a little over a year with us, Jeffrey was transferred to another residential house. After he had moved, he added me as a friend on Facebook. Due to the fact that we no longer shared a professional relationship, I added him back. Jeffrey began to message me no less than 20 times a day. I would reply occasionally. I figured perhaps he wasn't liking his new house, or maybe he just wanted to try and keep in contact. Most of his messages were simply, "Hey," "Hi," or "What's up?" After about a month or two, the messages picked up. At least 2 messages an hour, all hours of the day and night. After receiving a message stating, "It's very fucking rude to ignore someone's messages and not reply," I deleted and blocked Jeffrey on Facebook not long after that. It had gone from being annoying to unnerving. Everything was pretty quiet and returned to normal for about a month. One night after work, I came home to my normal apartment. I made myself dinner, played some Xbox, and went to bed about 12:30. Around 9:30 a.m., there was a knock at my door. I checked, but there was nobody there. I figured they just knocked on the wrong door, as there were several people living in my apartment complex at the time. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, my dog started to growl and bark. I awoke to the sound of the large window in my living room shattering. I immediately turned the bedroom light on and dialed 911. To my surprise, the attempted intruder was caught by security. Surprisingly, the police showed up much quicker than I thought they would have. They assessed the damage and made sure that there was nobody in my apartment and that nothing was missing. Before they left, they brought me outside to see if I could identify the intruder. When I walked outside, a part of me was shocked. There she sat, Sally, handcuffed in the back of the squad car. I was able to identify her immediately. In the aftermath, the police discovered that she had apparently been planning this for a long time. She had gotten into Jeffrey's Facebook, which he had not been using for a long time. Every message was from her. She had been keeping several diaries and would write about me in fantasies. Her tone would often change from happy and loving to angry and disturbed. She would often write about ending my life. Listening in court to those diary entries was the most disturbing part of it all. She was convicted to 6 years in prison for breaking and entering, and due to her various diary entries, she was also charged with premeditated intent to commit assault with a deadly weapon. Last I heard, her family had moved far away, and I can't say that I blamed them. I eventually found a new place to live. I just wasn't comfortable there anymore. Tensions were high around our apartment complex when I was around the age of 10. In a month's time, we had a man that committed suicide, a partial fire in a building leading to reconstruction, and a child that had been hit by a car who later survived. Even at a younger age, I distinctly remember having a strong grasp on the bizarre events that were taking place. It had to be around spring of '97. My mom was single and raising me and my little sister, who was about 5 years old. She managed a different complex and would pick us up from school and drop us off at our apartment, while she returned to work for a couple more hours. I have 3 older siblings who all moved out at this point. We had to keep an eye on each other at a young age. This wasn't really a new premise for me. There was no money for a sitter. The oldest just had to assume the role, which was me. For the most part, we were really quiet kids. We played with our toys, watched a little television, and sometimes played Sega or Nintendo. On this particular afternoon, I recall playing with my Star Wars figurine, while my little sister was doing whatever in the same living room. Suddenly the doorknob started violently shaking. My heart dropped, and I remembered being the first time I felt such terror. I rushed to the phone and paged my mom, and then dialed 911 to let the operator know that someone was breaking in. The operator reassured me that help was on the way. The door handle was still being messed with, but I was nervous if the deadbolt and chain would be enough. A couple of loud bangs happened, as if someone was ramming our door with their shoulder, and then it just stopped. The cops arrived shortly before my mom, only to find a note from the maintenance man saying, "Air filter check." Now the maintenance man claimed that he announced himself verbally, but I knew that was bullshit. Of course, the cops did nothing, and my mom's complaint to the office didn't result in this man being fired. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the most unnerving part of the story. My mom said the guy would stare her down in the parking lot and just smile at her. The whole situation creeped us out, and we wanted to move, but we couldn't afford the expenses. One night, a couple of weeks later, I was awakened by a loud thud coming from the roof. I was rattled, and I ran to my mom's room to wake her up. She checked around to make sure everything was in place and assured me it was probably just a rodent. We went to school the next morning and we were dropped off at home in the afternoon as usual. Mom usually did a quick sweep of the place, even before the attempted break-in, but this time something seemed off. It was just a very uneasy feeling that came over us when we walked into our apartment. My sister and I were ordered to stay downstairs by the front door, while she investigated upstairs. We waited patiently and felt very unnerved, when suddenly our mother's shrieking confirmed our suspicions. She came barreling down the stairs and ushered us out of the door. We went to a neighbor's and phoned the police. My mother was barking at them. "Someone is in our apartment." The police responded pretty quickly, and I was finally able to understand the situation. The bedroom had a walk-in closet that contained a hatch to the attic. It connected the entire building's AC and heat. There were shelves that were pretty high up lining the closet walls. My mother walked in to find a dirty pair of men's underwear lying on the floor. This was enough to send her running and phoning the police. However, the investigation revealed something more. The attic hatch had been disturbed. Just to add, the police found full handprints on the shelves in the closet. The noises I heard the previous night before were more than likely this man hoisting himself back up into the crawl space, using the shelves to climb on after visiting us. This man was taken into custody, but I don't recall what the sentencing was. We ended up moving to my grandfather's house shortly after. One summer, a friend and I took a trip to the US. We're both Irish guys in our early 20s. We took Greyhound buses and Amtrak from place to place. Since I'm the more organized one, I looked after booking our tickets and reservations. And when it came to staying in Chicago, I thought I struck gold by finding a room at the Hilton at a ridiculously affordable price. It seemed like a major upgrade to the dumps we had been staying in. But as we got off the 20-hour train journey from New Orleans, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The hotel was in Addison, Illinois, not the Chicago neighborhood of Addison where we had planned on staying. It was a blimp on the map that at the time consisted of little more than a road sign, a petrol station, a White Castle, and our hotel. Luckily, the hotel offered a discount taxi service through a cab company that they were affiliated with, and sent someone out to pick us up. This is where things took a turn. The guy shows up, pops the trunk, and just as we were putting our bags in, there was a roar from behind us. "Hey, you can't take that cab. He has out-of-town plates. That's against the law." A burly cabbie was enraged by the fact that our driver had to pick us up right in front of a queue of cabs. I got about 2 words into my explanation when our driver lunged for the guy, screaming, "You fucking bastard, I'll kill you. I have my iron pipe right here and I swear to God, I'll beat you until you fucking die." Looking back, this is where we should have brought things to a halt. But the truth is, we didn't have enough money for a normal cab to ride somewhere so far out of town. So being the 2 awkward Irish guys, we just got in the car, gazed in the opposite direction, and hoped that the matter would resolve itself. I'm not proud of that. After jumping back in the car, still cursing, the driver gunned it down the wrong side of the street at rush hour, evidently making up for lost time, while venting road rage in the direction of any honking horns. It seemed like he had been drinking, but bailing out of a car that was moving that fast genuinely seemed like a terrible idea. At some point between claiming that he should have been a race car driver and calling us pussies for wearing seatbelts, he told us a story about how he recently beat the shit out of a customer who didn't tip him enough. In my head, I tried to play this off as just a slightly unnerving, if not terribly effective way of ensuring a fat bonus, but the sight of my friend nervously counting a handful of sweat-soaked $1 bills gave me a sinking feeling. While I looked after booking reservations, he was responsible for things like taxi fares. Between us, we had enough cash to cover the trip, before tip. This is where the implications escalated from vague threat to certain danger. The cab driver kept offering to show us his pipe, the same one he used to take care of the bad tipper. Despite our polite objections, he actually took the pipe out from under the seat, turning it around to wave it at us, with a maniacal laugh, while the car sped on. I couldn't tell which was scarier, the feeling that we were about to crash any minute, or the looming confrontation when we would inevitably shortchange him. We were going so fast that the force of the wind coming through the open window took my breath away, intensifying this feeling of shock. Definitely the most distressing journey I've ever been on. Miraculously, the speeding had shaved valuable dollars off the total, leaving just enough for a small tip. We have been saved by the very excess that terrified us. I jumped out the moment we stopped, searching for help just in case things kicked off, but the driver seemed satisfied, gave us his card, and said to call him any time. He said he would be glad to drink whiskey and get into some fights with us. No thanks. Once we got to the safety of our hotel room, we just sat there, shaking, shell-shocked, trying to absorb what the fuck just happened.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
I'm a 26-year-old female, and exactly a year ago today I was at a house party in rural Connecticut. A family friend was throwing a college graduation party for their daughter, and had invited what felt like her entire graduating class. Their 2-story house was extremely spacious, and felt kind of regal. It had balconies off each bedroom on the 2nd story, 2 full-size kitchens, and several dozen acres of mostly wide-open property surrounding the house. I was about 4 months pregnant at the time, and after a couple of hours of socializing, I began to feel drained from mingling with dozens of people I didn't really know. I retreated to one of the bedrooms upstairs to put my feet up. My husband came upstairs with me, and we went into one of the bedrooms facing the backyard. Across the hall were several of the younger kids in another bedroom, playing video games very loudly. As I lay on the bed, my husband sat beside me, rubbing one hand on my stomach, while he sampled a variety of craft beers he had selected from downstairs. We were shooting the shit, and he was giving me his opinions on the brews, as I couldn't sample them myself. And after about 10 minutes or so, he started massaging my tired feet. I happened to glance over to the table where the TV was, and noticed something that seemed out of place. There was a flathead screwdriver perched awkwardly, practically hanging off the side of the table. The screwdriver by itself wouldn't have been too weird, but the fact that it was extremely rusty and coated with old dirt made me suspicious. It didn't seem like the owners of the house would use that kind of tool, especially in this room, where everything was so pristine. As strange as it was, I didn't want to say anything to my husband, because I didn't want anything to distract him from rubbing my feet. There is nothing sexier than a good foot massage. After I'd say was another 10 minutes, both myself and my husband jumped when someone started lighting off fireworks on the back lawn, and an explosion of noise and red sparks suddenly came from outside the balcony window. The rowdy kids in the next room suddenly got very loud at the noise, and I heard them drop a few expletives. My husband walked over to the door and poked his head out into the hallway, calling out to them to quiet down. That's when I turned my head and saw it, just outside on the balcony. Looking in at me, I saw half of a face peering around the corner, the silhouette of a body outlined against a new explosion of green fireworks. I screamed for my husband as the man outside turned the knob and walked into the bedroom. The best way I can describe the way he looked was how Brandon Lee looked in the movie The Crow. He was tall and thin. His cheekbones and jawline looked like they were practically tearing themselves out from under his skin. He had long, greasy black hair and wore torn and ragged black clothing with heavy boots. He grabbed the screwdriver off the table without looking at me and disappeared back onto the balcony. He was in the bedroom for perhaps 4 seconds, but it was enough time for my husband to turn around and see him. He then shouted, "Who the fuck?" The man leapt off the 2nd-story balcony, and my husband dashed outside and called after him as he walked across the backyard and disappeared around the side of the house. There were about 60 people in the backyard, but most of them had their eyes on the fireworks, and the music was so loud they couldn't hear my husband and I screaming. We immediately sprinted downstairs and told the homeowners, but they were half-plastered and didn't take what we said very seriously. My husband and I wanted to call the cops, but the owners blew off that notion like we were waiters offering them dessert. My husband returned upstairs and got all the kids to come down, and he told me that while he was up there, he checked the lock on the balcony and reported it had been broken from the outside. We informed the handful of sober people we knew who were still there and left. To this day, I don't know who that man was. My husband suspects it might have been the eldest daughter's dealer, as it was her room we were chilling in. Frankly, I don't care who it was. He had been out there on that balcony for at least 20 minutes watching me and my husband as we sat peacefully inside. If he had wanted to, he could have easily made to stab either of us with a screwdriver before he leapt out into the night. We haven't gone back to that house since. Growing up, I lived in a small town in a heavily forested area. Around 2nd grade, my best friend, who shall be known as Celia, began complaining to me about very strange things happening in her house. The first thing she pointed out to me was a small hole that was forming in the walls of her unfinished basement. The walls were made of a sort of brick cinder block material, but expanding as if the bricks were crumbling. I remember asking Celia if her parents knew about this, and she told me that they weren't worried. Fast forward some odd years later, around 4th or 5th grade, the hole had only become larger over time, and we could now fit a large portion of our arms into the hole. As far as my arm would go, I couldn't feel the end of the hole, and we couldn't explain why it had corroded deeper into the house, but it hadn't gotten much bigger in girth. At this point, Celia also began telling me that she could hear voices from her basement, and that she believed that most of it was coming from the hole. I never heard any of these sounds when I would visit her house, but considering we were only 10 years old when this happened, I totally believed her. We frequently had sleepovers on weekends, which was when I was usually exposed to all the creepy things wrong with her house. Her family was kinda strange in the fact that they had an abnormal amount of animals. They had 6 cats and dogs, a few rabbits, birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish, etc. Around the time when she was hearing the voices, we began to notice her cats and dogs would randomly disappear and would be found later in the basement, standing right in front of the hole. In all the years I've known her and her animals, they had never liked to be in the basement. It started to really scare us, and she was telling me that she believed that there was something living in the walls, and that the hole was one of the places it would peer into the house. At this point in time, I did believe her, but I never really seen enough proof to be as scared as she was. In school, she spent most of her time in an anxious wreck. The teachers and the other classmates were really worried about her. It really seemed like her parents just didn't care. A lot of the adults believed that she was only anxious because her older sister had left for college. Now here's where we get to the really terrifying part. I was sleeping over at her house during the weekend, over the Christmas holiday. On a side note about Celia's room, is that she has a huge collection of stuffed animals of all sizes, clearly because of her family's love of animals. Anyways, the first night we were sleeping in her bed, and when we woke up the next morning, all the animals were facing and staring right at us. I don't believe now, and I didn't at the time either, that Celia could have moved all those toys. I've always been an extremely light sleeper, and some of the animals were on top of a very large wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia believed to be living in the walls had to have been responsible for this. We put back all the animals very carefully, and we never told her parents. I sort of wish we had now, since I was staying the entire weekend. We went again to sleep that night in her bed. We woke up around the same time, and it was still dark out. We both heard a very low, creaking noise that was coming from underneath us. We both knew it was the wooden floorboards under her bed, just like in a textbook horror movie, and probably because we were only 10, we thought it was a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look under. Right as we looked, we saw and heard one of the floorboards slam back into the ground. We shot our heads back up and held each other and cried. I've never been so scared in my life, and I called my parents the next morning to come take me home right away. I refused to ever go back to Celia's house in fear, and she only got worse at school. I don't remember if I ever continued to ask her about the things in her house. Maybe I didn't because I was just too scared, and we were so young. For unrelated circumstances, my family moved far away from that town that summer, and I had only seen her twice after that, and that was over a decade ago. I have never heard from her since, and I've always wondered what happened, as I know her family still lives in that house today. Many have suggested that this might be paranormal. I tried to be very detailed, but I left out my personal thoughts on the matter, because the scariest part is not knowing. My theory is that there was a man, or a group of people living in the walls of her house. The hole was their way of seeing and hearing what was going on in the basement, and if no one was in the basement, they would come out. The stuffed animals had to have been by someone who was disturbed and wanted to mess with us. The next night, the floorboard trick might have been a way to listen if we were sleeping. Since I only saw one floorboard move, there is no way that was how they got into the room. They probably had several surveillance points so they knew when they could move around the house. So this was not a paranormal encounter. In a way, this was far worse. Last October, I took a trip from Washington State to Texas with my boyfriend. He had a great uncle who had passed away and left him a few dozen acres of property in his will. We flew down to inspect the land and decide whether to keep it or sell it. The property was pretty much a wide open patch of dirt with a nice view of the hills without much to offer us. So we decided to sell most of it and build a small house on the land that we kept to live in during the winter months and to rent out during the summer. After the house was finished, we flew back down and moved ourselves in for the remainder of the winter. It wasn't anything super lavish, just something simple and small the two of us could enjoy. After about a week of being there, we were sitting on the front porch when a dusty old pickup truck with deer antlers mounted on the top of the cab came rolling up. A middle-aged couple got out and approached us in a friendly manner, introducing themselves as former neighbors of my boyfriend's great uncle. The couple seemed pleasant enough, and they even brought a 12-pack of Shiner beer with them. I thought it was kind of presumptuous of them being complete strangers to show up unannounced, but I figured this must be how people down south do things. We didn't know anyone in the area anyway, and figured we might as well try to make friends. They introduced themselves as Reuben and Charlotte Wallace, and said that they had been hunting buddies with Uncle Trevor, and told us stories of their camping trips and shooting heads off snakes. They were polite enough people, but their southern boldness and casual way of discussing guns and killing animals for sport was very foreign to me, and I didn't really form any kind of connection with them. My boyfriend seemed to enjoy their company slightly more, and when they invited us over for dinner the following night, he accepted before even consulting me, which was irritating. The following night we arrived at their very old farmhouse, which was much further away from Uncle Trevor's former place than we had expected. We brought some wine and some beer, not knowing what they prefer to have with dinner, and were greeted before we even reached the front door by Charlotte. The house reeked of cigarette smoke and had a kind of musky, unhealthy feeling to it, like the house was rotting from the inside out. Every room seemed to have at least one American flag, one firearm, and one mounted animal head. I wasn't digging it at all, but my boyfriend seemed unperturbed and didn't hesitate in cracking open a beer with Reuben. We were eating in their dining room, seated next to their wide-open sliding patio door, which I thought was strange as it let in the bugs. We were eating a very unimaginative meal of beans and what they claimed was venison, but if it was, I don't think it had been preserved properly, or at the very least was undercooked. I had tried venison before, and this didn't taste right. After 20 minutes, the casual conversation died, and instead, a more interesting and meaningful conversation started up. Things began to get kind of awkward and quiet. Reuben began paying more attention to stroking his beard and looking at us, rather than the food. He began to ask us questions about our uncle's old house and personal possessions, and if he had ever mentioned them to us. I began to get a very uneasy feeling in my gut that the Wallaces were digging for information about Uncle Trevor and were slowly starting to drop the friendly southern neighbor act. My boyfriend didn't have very many answers for them, as he rarely spoke to his uncle when he was growing up, but instead of taking the hint, they just kept on pressing us. Charlotte kept staring right at me, watching me eat, as she shoveled food between her gray teeth, hardly even blinking. I decided to excuse myself for a smoke, and wandered outside out to the open patio door. She said I was free to light up at the table, but I was already out the door. I didn't actually smoke, but was just using it as a signal to tip my boyfriend off that I was uncomfortable and wanted to leave. I wandered out around their backyard and walked around behind their shed, thinking I could at least snap some pictures with my phone of the horizon as the sun set. There was a smell coming from the shed that practically made me gag. It reminded me of a forgotten dumpster that had been baking in the sun for years. I took a few pictures and casually started making my way back to the house. when I noticed about 15 or 20 pairs of shoes, mostly sneakers and cowboy boots, piled in a heap on the far side of the shed. I walked over to get a better look and noticed that they appeared to be several different sizes. Some were so old and dusty, I could barely make out what original color they had been. I got a sinking feeling in my stomach and cautiously pushed open the shed door. Inside were literally piles upon piles of clothes, hats, and backpacks scattered all around the shed, like a nightmarish Goodwill drop-off, and dark stains heavily covered the creaky wooden floor. I noticed how the stains formed a pattern, like a trail that led to the door, indicating that multiple somethings had been dragged out of the shed over time. I backed away, suddenly feeling very nauseous, and my heart nearly failed me when Charlotte was suddenly standing behind me. She started to say something along the lines of, "Now why'd you go sticking your head in there?" That's when I noticed she had a serrated knife in her hand. I've taught self-defense to young women for many years. I put the heel of my hand directly up to her nose and broke it, sending blood spurting into the air. I screamed for my boyfriend, who came running out of the patio door towards me. I kicked the fallen knife across the dirt and cried for him to run. We sprinted to the car and floored it backwards out of the driveway. Ruben appeared on the front porch and fired at least one shot from a rifle at our car, but fortunately missed. And by the time he raised his rifle for a second shot, we had made it to the road and drove like hell out of there. We didn't go home, but instead drove right into town to the police station, where I gave my statement. They sent 3 cars to the house, and we heard an exchange of gunfire over the radio. Ruben was killed at the scene in the shootout, but Charlotte was never found. The police couldn't locate her on the property. An APB was put out for her at local hospitals in case she sought treatment for her nose, but nothing ever came of it. We returned home for the night, and a police cruiser remained parked outside our house until dawn. A few days later, a detective came to our house and determined that Ruben and Charlotte Wallace were fake names the couple had given us, and that they were really 2 fugitives wanted for several counts of attempted murder in Arizona. Apparently, they made a habit of patrolling the border and shot at any illegals they found trying to cross. From there, it seemed like they brought the bodies back to their property for disposal. It turns out that Uncle Trevor had known about their activities and had been blackmailing them to keep him quiet. I had to excuse myself to go vomit. I didn't know for sure, therefore I didn't say anything to the police. But in my bones, I felt like they had served us human meat. But for exactly what reason, I had no idea. Some reporters came to interview us, but we refused to comment on anything. My boyfriend and I still spend time between Washington and Texas, though when we stay in Texas, we have 2 pit bulls sleep on our front porch to alert us if anyone unwelcome is approaching. To the best of my knowledge, they never found Charlotte, and if she's still out there, I just pray that we never meet again. So back sometime in January of 2013, I was up late suffering from insomnia and watching Moonrise Kingdom. I live in Canada, and this particular night the temperature was holding steady in the single digits. It was probably around 2 or 3 degrees out, and the roads were like sheets of ice. The only thing I had to eat in the house were oyster crackers and ketchup, so I decided to pause the movie, bundle myself up tight, and brave the frigid wasteland outside to go get some snacks from the mini-mart a few miles away. After putting on several layers of clothing, I stepped outside, locked the door to my townhouse, and walked over to my car. It was so cold out, it actually hurt to breathe, and for a moment, I reconsidered going at all, but my hunger overpowered my discomfort, and I chiseled the ice off my windshield and climbed inside my car. I put the key in the ignition and started the car, and immediately turned on the heater but not the headlights. As I was waiting for the inside of the car to warm up, I noticed a red Cavalier drive past me down the street and pull into the driveway of the townhouse that was kitty-cornered from my own. Not having much to occupy my time as the car slowly warmed up, I watched as 3 people exited the Cavalier, and my heart immediately began to race, as I noticed one of the people in the car had his hands tied behind him. The man who had been in the back seat with the bound man immediately hit him with what looked like a tire iron, and the defenseless man collapsed into the snow. The tire iron man kept beating him, striking his legs and back, and I could see red patches of blood starting to stain the snow around the fallen man. For some context, this was some time after midnight, so there was no traffic or anyone else outside. The only light illuminating the street was coming from about 3 or 4 surrounding streetlights. I didn't recognize any of the men, but I faintly heard them shouting at each other, though I couldn't catch their exact words. The man who had been in the driver's seat came around the side of the car and pulled out a handgun from his jacket. I remembered actually shouting, "Oh shit!" before clamping my hands over my mouth. I was convinced that I was about to witness a murder, and I was terrified. There was no sense of excitement or grim fascination. This wasn't a movie. This was violent, unscripted reality, and I was suddenly feeling very traumatized. I didn't want to be a witness for what was possibly coming next. My car was on and running, but so was theirs, which was probably why they hadn't noticed me. I didn't dare try to sprint back inside, but I also didn't want to try my luck driving down the icy street, where they could have easily chased after me if they chose to. The driver bent down and put his gun to the head of the bleeding man. He remained in that position for a while, and I assumed he must have been talking to him. I began to let myself breathe easier, daring to hope they were just going to get back in the car and drive away without killing him. And then I could call him an ambulance. I had my cell phone in my pocket. Now you might be asking, if I had a phone, why wasn't I calling the cops? Because this is Canada, and the cops just don't give a shit. I also didn't want to risk making any noise or giving my position away with the light of my cell phone screen. You may think this was cowardly of me, and maybe it was, but until you've been in this situation and there's a guy with a gun 50 yards away from you, I say you've got no right to judge. Anyway, this whole time the guy with the tire iron had just been standing there, no hat, no gloves, in the freezing cold, staring down at the bleeding man, when my car's engine suddenly stuttered. He glanced up and looked right towards me, and I swear I felt my heart stop. For a moment, he just stared in my direction, and I froze like a deer in the headlights, praying that he wouldn't see me. I'm a pretty scrawny guy, and wouldn't have had a chance of defending myself against this dude, even without the weapon. Suddenly he began to make his way across the street towards me. Maybe he noticed the cloud of exhaust coming from my car, or he was just trying to get a better look. Either way, my fight or flight mode kicked in, and I wasn't going to wait for him to get closer. I killed the engine, leapt out of my car without even shutting the door, and sprinted as fast as I could towards my front door, across the icy driveway. I heard the guy yell, "Hey!" and I was convinced that at any moment I would hear a gunshot, and suddenly I would hit the ground, bleeding out with the light starting to fade. But thank God, that never happened. I reached the front door and frantically stuffed the keys into the lock. As I turned the knob, I heard the tire iron guy curse and hit the ground. I guess he had slipped onto the ice, but I didn't turn to find out. Once inside, I slammed the door, locked it, and immediately barricaded myself in the guest bedroom, which only had one small window facing the backyard. I left all the lights off and just lay on the ground next to the bed, my heart racing, breathing heavily, expecting at any moment to hear pounding from the front door, but it never came. I lay there cowering for what felt like 20 minutes when I heard footsteps out in the hallway. I clamped my hands over my mouth to muffle my breathing and strained my ears for any sound from outside the bedroom door. I hadn't heard the front door open, but the soft, steady thudding of heavy feet coming down the carpeted hallway was clear. I told myself that as soon as I heard the doorknob jiggle, I was calling the cops on my cell phone and telling them that my house was on fire. That would get them here quick. After a moment, I thought I heard the footsteps in the living room again, and then nothing at all. I was convinced that the intruder was hiding somewhere in my own house, waiting for me to emerge so he could pounce on me. That was the absolute longest night of my life, and I waited wide awake and terrified, convinced that I was going to die. When the sun eventually came up, I finally found the courage to leave the bedroom. I picked up an empty wine bottle to defend myself as I walked down the hall carefully and peeked outside. There were 2 police cars parked outside my neighbor's yard, and the Cavalier was gone. I didn't recall hearing any gunshots. I walked into my kitchen to take a look around, and froze when I noticed my back door was unlocked. My heart sank as I noticed one word that had been carved into my wooden table: quiet. About an hour later, the cops knocked on my front door and informed me that there had been an assault last night. My neighbor was in the hospital and they asked me if I had seen anything. I lied and said I had passed out at midnight watching movies and had just woken up. That might have been a shit thing to do, but I didn't want to have my name be involved. Whoever these men had been, they were unstable and dangerous and knew where I lived. I didn't want to have to be dragged into court to testify against them. The police asked me if I knew my car door was slightly open. I said no, but simply shrugged and stated that I might have forgotten to slam it shut. They seemed to buy that and left, without any further questions. I threw out the table and got a new one, and have since put in a new security system. I'm not necessarily proud of how I acted that night, but I have no regrets either. Had I tried to be a hero, I might have been killed, so call me a coward if you want, but at least I'm alive. I've never made another attempt to go on a late night snack run ever since. I think this story will be improved by some context about the setting and such, so here we go. First, this story took place after I graduated high school and moved away from my family. I moved up to Alaska again. I say again, because I lived there once before and attended college there. Second, and very conveniently, my mother had been renting out our old house instead of selling it. I say conveniently because the long-standing residents had moved away, and therefore, I was awarded the old house. I had to work quite a bit to keep up the payments, but my mother pitched in, thankfully. Third, at the beginning of this story, I should make you aware that I had recently broken up with a girl who had been staying with me in the old house I was renting through my mother, and this breakup was unclean and dysfunctional, much like the relationship itself was. And so finally, the story begins. It was winter break, which means I would be spending more time inside than I normally would. It was somewhat lonely in the house, being without a stable girlfriend then. Also, there was no neighbors really to speak of, as the house was in an extremely wooded region a few miles out of town. One late afternoon, soon after I thought the whole breakup predicament had come to a close, I was made quite aware that it wasn't. My cell phone began ringing, and I saw that it was from an unknown number. Cliché, I know, and I decided to pick it up. It was, of course, my ex. She began telling me about how great her new boyfriend is, and how horrible I was and am. The sort of talk you can smell the booze off the caller's breath from miles away. I actually listened until she decided to hand the phone over to her boyfriend, where he was instead sounding oddly threatening, and I decided to hang up in the most polite manner possible with a "fuck you, have a nice day." Days later, again with my mind beginning to forget, only this time about the most certainly drunken phone call, I'm lying in the living room couch watching some TV. While lying there, I noticed something quite unsettling. A person standing in the window behind me. You may ask, how did I notice this? The reflection from the TV screen is how. I didn't move an inch. I had no gun, no knife. I had nothing but my wit and my fists. I just lie there, watching the reflection. Eventually, it moved away from the window. That normally wouldn't spook me, but I was taking into account that 1. The house was nowhere near another, so that's a red flag. 2. If someone was just wanting to talk, they would knock. And 3. I was almost certain it was that boyfriend of hers. Nothing became of that situation, but similar situations continued, such as a car pulling into the driveway and no one getting out, then leaving inconspicuously. This was worrisome at the least, but I didn't suspect a true threat. A few days later, I'm lying in bed. It was very late and I was getting ready to sleep. I get another call from an unknown number. It was her again, but this time she was asking me to come outside because she wanted to give me an apology. At the time I was thinking, oh, shall we say, fuck off. Though I still went outside to see what the deal was. I opened the door and of course, it's incredibly dark. I say into the phone, I'm outside. Come around back. With this, I began to walk on the snow-covered ground in the darkness with my just put on boots. The motion light turns on as I cross the garage and driveway. The snow masking the ground is tinted yellow by the light. I round the corner of the garage and turn my phone to see. There's a road that runs behind my house and connects to the driveway by bending, and I make my way towards the road. The snow crunches beneath my boots as I make my way closer. There's a part in the trees that allows me to walk straight to the road. Otherwise, no one could make their way around the entirety of the driveway. I reach this part. I ask into the phone, "Where are you?" "I'm in the car. I see you." I step onto the road, and I see her parked car a few dozen feet away from me with the lights dimmed. "So what's the deal?" "I just want to talk. Come here." I approach the car and I make my way around to the passenger side, and I finally see her face. She waves me in, and I oblige. I get in the car and sit down. I look at her and she says, "Look, I'm sorry, I know I've been a real bitch lately. No, it's okay. I wasn't really good to you and I deserve it. I don't agree, but..." She abruptly stopped speaking because a pair of car lights shined from behind us. Naturally, I assume it's her boyfriend, and by the look in her face, she did too. The car parks behind us and sure enough, the boyfriend gets out and storms over to my side of the car. He yanks on the door handle and the door swings open. He attempts to grab me, but I grab his wrist and get out of the car.
"What the fuck do you think you're doing with her, huh?"
"We're just talking, and I was about to leave."
"Bullshit. You're trying to fuck her, aren't you?"
"Look, I'm trying to sleep. I'm in no mood to do anything." He gave me this look of utter enragement before swinging at me, and of course missing. A little scuffle ensued, and all that happened was him swearing and eventually slipping and falling, before yelling at us both,
"I'll fucking kill you."
I just stood by her car as he pulled away. She gave me a lift back to the house and I invited her inside, and she obliged. It was late in the night, and I suggested that she lock her car if she was going to stay the night. We slept upstairs in my bed before I awoke hours later. There was a banging at the back door, and I knew this because the back door was directly below my room. She woke up too and said, "Oh my God." I stood up quickly and got to my closet and reached behind the coats that I never wear, and I grabbed my Louisville Slugger. She was sitting upright in my bed with her hands covering her eyes. I didn't say anything before walking down the stairs slowly, attempting to be silent. The lights were off and there were no windows on the staircase, and the pounding on the back door had audibly ceased. I held the bat tightly, making sure it didn't bang into the wall to signal my position at the time. I remember how slowly I stepped down, especially on the bottom 3 steps, which were always the creakiest. Once I reached the final step, I froze, and it still gives me chills to this day. The hardwood floors creak around the bottom of the staircase, and there was a creaking that was growing closer and closer. I raised the bat above my head, ready to slam whoever it was right on top of the head. The creaking grew closer until I could hear it from my side, and I planned to swing as soon as it was in front of me. As the staircase opened to the left from the bottom coming up, I listened ever so carefully, holding my breath. The creaking came to my northeast, and I squeezed my hands tighter than I ever had before around the bat, waiting for it to come just north of me. There was more creaking sounds. This time, they were directly in front of me, and I slammed the bat down hard, and it hit something, and whatever it was crumpled to the floor with a bang and a small flash. I turned on the light, and there he was, the boyfriend. He had shot his gun directly at the floor and left a hole in the hard wood. My ex came down the stairs crying profusely, muttering, "I'm so sorry," over and over again. I called the police, and 4 cops pulled into my driveway along with an ambulance in a matter of minutes. I sat at the base of the stairs, watching the boyfriend. He was breathing. I could tell from his chest slowly inclining and declining off the floor. I grabbed what I thought was a 9mm off the floor and kept it in my hand with the safety turned on. I just shook my head over and over in utter disbelief. I explained the situation to the police as the paramedics rushed in and carried him out on a stretcher. All in all, I didn't get to sleep until late in the afternoon, after everything was done and over with. He ended up actually being induced into a coma, but eventually recovered, and a restraining order had already been filed in advance. My ex and I became good friends after the incident, and she never dated that guy again. I never ended up moving out though. I had considered it, but nothing like that has happened since. And there you have it. A year ago I was 28, living in a condo in southern Arizona. I'm a single parent and live with my 3 children and my dog, a Belgian Shepherd named Loki. The neighborhood that we lived in was very quiet and friendly. My children would often play outside with the neighbor kids on a daily basis, and I didn't have to watch them like a hawk. Plus my neighbor worked in his garage all day and was able to keep an eye on the kids as well. One fall night last year, I was doing my usual chores, vacuuming, cleaning the rooms, and washing the clothes. I wanted to do as much as I could before the kids came back from their grandparents' house the next morning. I had a sliding glass door in my bedroom that I usually left open halfway, so that it would be easier for me to go back and forth to the garage where the washing machine was. Loki also loved to have it open because it was an easy access for him to run back and forth, inside and outside. I went through my sliding glass door and opened the garage, and when I was putting the lid back down, I turned around and saw Loki growling with his eyes fixed on the roof. I looked up to see what he was growling at, but I didn't see anything. Figuring that it was only a stray cat, I started walking back into the house and was about to slide the door shut behind me when I noticed Loki hadn't moved and was still out in the alley. I normally didn't have to call him. He usually just followed me. I called for him, but he didn't so much as look my way. He was sitting still, looking up at the roof, as if he were waiting for something to appear. Then suddenly, he jumped up and started snarling and barking viciously at the roof. At the same time, I heard heavy thumps moving across my roof over my head. That was frightening enough, but what scared me the most was the way Loki reacted. I had only ever seen him act like that once before, and that was almost when I got robbed, when I was stationed back in Washington years earlier. I quickly pulled Loki inside and shut the door, very shaken, pacing back and forth and crying and growling. I texted one of my neighbors and asked if he could please swing by my house. I didn't feel confident in my suspicions enough to call the police. When my neighbor arrived, he physically climbed up on the roof and didn't find anything. We concluded that it was just probably a cat, but I couldn't shake the gut feeling that those thumps across the roof sounded far too heavy to be made by a cat. A few days go by, and I didn't hear anything more, so I almost forgot about it. Then the next morning comes, and before it was fully light out, I was awake and brushing my daughter's hair and getting her ready for school, when I heard loud footsteps across my roof. I got my old military machete from under my bed and ran out back with Loki. There was nothing. I circled around to the front. Nothing. I went inside to reassure my daughter that it was probably a cat. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and said, "It sounded like someone was running." Later that day when I came home from work, I saw police cars down the street at my neighbor Colleen's house with an ambulance. Colleen was a very sweet, older and fragile lady. I eventually found out that someone had broken into her house while she was napping, and Colleen apparently startled the assailant, and he had shoved her into the wall and broken her hip. Colleen lay upon the ground in pain, unable to move until her daughter came to check on her. The police officer started questioning the rest of us, asking us if we had seen or heard anything suspicious lately. I immediately told the officers everything about the footsteps on my roof and how Loki had reacted. In response, the police had officers patrol our neighborhood for about a week. I told my daughters what was going on and explained to them that they couldn't play outside as freely as they were used to for a while. 2 weeks passed and I was still on guard. It was late one night and I needed to do some laundry, and I decided that I wasn't going to let my nerves prevent me from getting my parental chores done. So I had my glass door open and ready. On the very last load, I was walking towards the garage. I paused dead on my tracks and didn't move, barely breathing, trying not to make a sound. Then I heard another creak. I slowly looked up and finally realized where it was coming from, directly above me. My heart sank and my blood went cold, and I know the feeling of being watched wasn't just my imagination. Suddenly, Loki was by my side. He snarled and barked viciously while trying to jump up on his hind legs. I dropped my basket and ran back inside. Just as I made to close the door, I screamed for Loki to come. He came running inside, and I immediately locked the door. Barely after a moment I did, I saw a shadowy figure jump down from my roof. My oldest daughter came in, and I told her to get my phone and take her siblings into her bedroom and call 911. Loki was barking furiously and foaming at the mouth, desperately wanting to get at this motherfucker. I was absolutely terrified and shaking uncontrollably. The figure was still standing there in my backyard, not moving, and I was unable to take my eyes off him. I had been to war and seen terrible things, but when my children were now suddenly in the crossfire, this shit felt different. The strange man literally walked directly up to me, outside through the glass window, and started glaring at me with fire in his eyes as if I had just rear-ended his car. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt and held a crowbar in his hand. I remembered my machete was right next to me by the nightstand, but I didn't want the man to know that I had it yet. If he tried to break in, I wanted to be able to give him the surprise of his life. He jiggled the handle to try to open the door, then hit the door with the crowbar, but it didn't shatter. My kids were yelling hysterically as he started hitting the door harder and harder. Loki was enraged and leaning up against the glass, putting his own weight on it. I realized that this guy had every intention of coming in, so I grabbed my machete and yelled, "Come on, motherfucker!" The shock in his eyes was a glorious sight. A police officer jumped my fence and started shouting at him. When the guy didn't drop the crowbar, the cop tased him. As the officer put him in cuffs, I went to go get my kids, and when they saw me, they came running and started hugging me tight. The would-be home invader was charged and sent to prison. My kids are still going to therapy. I'm doing whatever I can to help them cope with everything. Loki is still with us, and we love him very much. If I ever see that guy again, I'm not going to hold back. Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I was, and I agree. But I always remind him that that guy was even more lucky he didn't break in through the glass and had to have dealt with me. This is a story my uncle told me before he died. Unfortunately, I'm unable to provide proof of this occurrence, but I don't think he would lie about something like this. I'm going to write this story from his perspective as it was told to me. It was the mid-1980s in Arkansas. My girlfriend at the time dragged me to a wedding. She was close friends with the bride. The wedding took place on a ranch. I have to say it was a pretty nice setup, surrounded on all sides by thick forest that stretched on for miles. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. It took us 3 hours just to reach this place from where we lived. But the journey was worth it, even though I didn't know a lot of people there. I still had a great time. I even danced, and I never dance. There was an open bar, so you can imagine that things got pretty wild as the night progressed. After about an hour of reenacting Saturday Night Fever on the dance floor, I sat down because my feet were starting to hurt. Before I go on, let me explain the layout. The ranch and the outdoor dance floor was located in a clearing, and it was surrounded on all sides by trees. There was a tree line about 35 to 40 yards away from where I was, and there was a lot of bright lights around the dance floor, but beyond that, it was completely dark. As I was sitting there rubbing my sore feet, I could see something taking place in the distance just outside the tree line. I couldn't see too clearly because of the lighting, but what I saw sort of amused me. I saw what looked like a dark figure dragging someone into the tree line. Again, it was hard to see, but I thought the person that was being dragged was wearing one of the bright yellow bridesmaid dresses. I chuckled when I saw that. I remembered thinking, looks like someone drank too much. I feel the need to point out that I too was a little intoxicated. Otherwise, I might have said something about someone being dragged away from the party into a dark forest. Maybe I thought the two were gonna get freaky in the woods or something. A few hours later, we left the wedding celebrations, but what I found out 2 days later made my stomach drop. Apparently, one of the bridesmaids went missing after the wedding. I told the police what I remembered seeing that night. The very next day, they found the body of the missing bridesmaid in the woods. She had been dismembered, and her limbs were found scattered throughout the forest. From what I hear, they didn't even recover all of her body parts. The person responsible for this was never found. I felt guilty for many years after, because I can't help but think I could have saved her life if I had said something. She wasn't even 20 years old yet. She had her whole life ahead of her, but she ended up in pieces. Here's some backstory about me. I lived in rural Kentucky my whole life. I'm 52 and currently semi-retired. I used to be a contractor, but suffered a nasty fall that rendered my left hip near useless. I'm on disability, but I do odd jobs in the local town, sell venison from deer I hunt, and help train younger contractors and give them advice. I try to keep myself busy. I have 2 with my ex-wife who are now in their late 20s, and 1 with my current wife who's turning 8 next month. My wife is Spanish, so my son looks fully Spanish even though he's half Caucasian. Everyone in town knows my name and my family and knows I'm a good, humble family man. I personally helped build the house we're currently living in, and it's deep in the woods. The nearest neighbor is about 3 miles away. Last weekend, my 8-year-old son woke me and my wife at 2 in the morning. Jake is a sensitive kid, so the slightest bump in the night caused him to panic. We're used to this, but when he said there was a fire outside in the woods, I was struck with alarm. Half awake, I looked outside my bedroom window and noticed that in the distance, the night sky was glowing orange and there was smoke about 500 yards away from our house. My wife started to panic, picking up the phone and attempting to call the local fire department. I took the phone from her shaking hands and set it aside. I knew it wasn't a wildfire because the light and smoke came from a singular area. A wildfire would have spread by now. Since the woods we live near are very dense, this was a controlled fire, which in a way was far worse, and the fire department wouldn't be able to help. I threw on my hunting gear and rushed my wife and son to the basement. I handed her my cell phone and told her to call her brother. Right before I shut the door, I told her to lock it and to not open it up for anyone other than her brother or myself. I retrieved my bolt-action rifle. My intention was not to harm anyone, but rather only to scare them off. But ultimately, I knew that was a decision that they were going to make for me. I deadbolted the front door and left the house. My wife's brother had a key, but wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. I ventured off in the almost complete darkness across my property, following the smell of smoke, the tinge of orange light in the sky, and the sound of the ever-increasing sermon being spewed. I get to the tree line that overlooks a clearing, and it's exactly what I expected. Klansmen. About 7 of them in a circle with their arms stretched out, while a smooth-talking preacher is spewing hate while using Christ as a justification. The preacher is standing in front of a makeshift cross as it continues to burn. I've had run-ins with the Klansmen before. Due to my property's relative seclusion, they tend to hold sermons in the woods surrounding my house. It only happens maybe twice a year, if not less. I usually fire a round off into the sky to tell them to back the fuck off, and they scatter. The preacher pauses for his followers to say amen and white power. That's when I shoot off a round into the sky, and all of them jump about 4 feet off the ground as I move towards the fire. You must be new. This is my property, and I don't appreciate these activities going on near my family. I loaded another bullet into the chamber and positioned my rifle near my right hip, not taking aim or showing hostility. While the other followers slowly stepped back, their preacher steps forward, coming within 30 yards of me. "This is your property?" he said with a thick Kentucky accent. I apologize. We scouted the area during the day and didn't see a single house around here. Do you mind telling us where you live? Just so we can meet further away from you and your family." I don't answer. This preacher's silver tongue may have been able to work on his flock of sheep, but it wasn't going to work on me. There was a tense silence between us before one of his sheep spoke up. "I know this guy. He's married to a fucking spick. He even has a half-breed with her." The other sheep began grumbling amongst themselves and moved closer towards me. I made a quick jerk with my rifle, raising it up below my shoulder to force them to back away. The preacher chuckled to himself before speaking. "So that's why you don't want to tell us where you live. You think we're gonna break in and harm your family. Good sir, we may hate your wife and child, but we ain't no savages." "You may not be, but I don't trust your friends," I said bluntly. I kept my rifle high, not aiming it at anyone directly, but positioning it at the ready in case I had to. "You can't choose who you love after all," the preacher said. I bet he was sporting a shit-eating grin under his hood while saying that. "You have my word that we will never lay a hand on you and your family. Perhaps we can arrange a deal." My stomach dropped, and my trigger hand trembled slightly. A vague threat was still a threat. "You don't bring this up with law enforcement or anyone else, and we'll relocate our get-togethers further away from your family. How I see it, you don't have much of a choice. You already fired 1 shot. Do you think you can take all 8 of us out with a bolt action? My friend, that simply isn't possible." I remained silent. I took a moment to breathe so I could make my voice remain strong and firm. even though my legs were beginning to shake and my palms were incredibly sweaty. Another 700 yards further into the woods, there's another clearing. If you hold your meetings there from now on, I won't acknowledge what you do, but if you ever come near me again, I'll bring more than a bolt action with me. Understand? My friend, you have yourself a deal. He offered his hand out to shake, but I stared him down right past the slits in his hood, rifle still raised below my shoulder. I didn't accept his hand. Very well. We will be on our way to check out this promising area. You can head on home now. Just be sure to tuck Jake in tight. This must have been just a dreadful experience for the poor boy. I stood dead still in total shock. My vision begins to blur as the preacher and his flock of sheep moved towards the location I pointed them to. Part of me wasn't surprised, since I worked in the community my entire life. The other part of me was in panic mode. If he knew my son, he knew where I lived. I often held local events at my home. This gathering was not a coincidence. It was a warning, a threat. I got a hold of myself and moved slowly back into the tree line, watching as their white robes faded into the darkness of the night. I hobbled as quickly as I could back to my home, looking over my shoulder whenever I heard a twig snap or the wind rustle the trees. When I finally made it back, I breathed a sigh of relief and let my wife's brother know what happened. I didn't tell my wife. If she knew, she would have never gotten a good night's sleep in that house again. My wife's brother slept in the guest bedroom in the basement. We took turns keeping guard during the night, and there wasn't a single sign of their return. But I'm still on high alert, even during the day, and especially when I go into town. So far, they have apparently kept their word. Right now, as I write this, I see the sky turning orange and the smoke starting to rise in the distance. It's far enough away to indicate that they're using the clearing I recommended. I just wish they weren't there to begin with. This story is told from the perspective of a female. At the time of this incident, I was 18, and a very not intimidating 5'2", slightly stocky but maybe 130 pounds at the most. I was staying at a friend's house, which is off a back road way out in the country of Mississippi. Her street was full of other family members, and once you got to the main road, it was an unlit, treacherous, curvy road that went through the woods and was covered on both sides by ditches. It would be suicide if you chose to drive drunk, especially at night. Now on to one of the creepiest moments of my life. I left her house around 1:30 in the morning, slightly buzzed, but was still coordinated enough to drive home. I turned my music up, lit up my high beams, and made the turn onto the main road. Less than 2 minutes away from my friend's house, out of nowhere, a lady suddenly appears in my headlights. I slammed on the brakes and pulled across the road into the oncoming lane and stopped. On the alert for a possible trap, I rolled down the passenger side window and asked if she was alright. She was probably in her late 20s, very disheveled and moving like she was walking across thin ice. After a moment, she replied in a raspy, slightly unhinged voice, "I'm very angry with my husband. I stepped out in front of your car to kill myself." No hesitation, just admitted that to me like she was offering coffee. "Are you fucking serious?" I shouted at her. She asked me for a light, even though she didn't seem to have any cigarettes, and shambled quickly over to my car. I rolled up my window as soon as she made to reach inside. I could already smell the liquor on her. She very nearly got her fingers caught in my window as soon as I started to roll forward. Then she started screaming at me and rambling on about how she hated her husband and wanted to die. I carefully drifted forward, watching her following me in my rearview mirror as I pulled my phone from my purse and attempted to dial 911. She started banging on my trunk with both hands, and I took my feet off the brake and gave it a little more gas just to put some distance between me and her. As the operator came online, by the light of my headlights, I noticed up the road that a red truck had crashed into a ditch. It had to have been recently, as the hood of the truck was smoking. The operator raised her voice and I realized she was repeating herself. I apologized to the woman and told her the name of the road I was on and the situation with the truck and the drunk suicidal woman still following me. Suddenly from the driver's side window, there came a loud thump, and the light of a cell phone started blinding me. I turned left to see a grizzled man right in my face, shining his phone's flashlight directly in my eyes and screaming for me to stop and open the fucking door. His face was covered in blood. I screamed so loudly that every 911 operator in the building probably heard me. I dropped my phone and floored it, leaving both the man and the woman behind. A bloody handprint staining my driver's side window. After a minute of driving close to 80 miles an hour, I slowed down and told the operator what happened. I hung up when she asked me my name, mostly because I was freaked out. I drove straight home and never called back. To this day, I don't know what their situation was or what became of them. I just know that I'm never driving down an isolated road at night in Mississippi again. I grew up in southern Mississippi, and like most Mississippi kids, my parents were super young when they had me. My mom was a major alcoholic for most of her life, and it was pretty bad back then. My dad worked all the time, which meant my younger sister and I got to spend all of our time with her. Sometimes when she needed a break from us or just wanted to go on another bender, she would leave us with my great aunt, who was 98 years old at the time and very senile. Her property also borders the state mental hospital. My grandmother used to tell us stories about being at my great aunt's house when random people would wander up to the house asking to use the phone. Sometimes they would still be wearing hospital gowns. I was 8 years old when this specific incident happened. My mom dropped us off sometime in the afternoon on Friday. My sister, who was 5, went straight to the living room to play with toy horses next to my great aunt, who was wrapped up in knitting a blanket on her recliner while watching TV. A timer in the kitchen went off, and she asked me to take some biscuits out of the oven. As I walked past a window that overlooked a large old willow tree in the front yard, I thought I saw the figure of a man under the branches. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the shadows, so I called over for my great aunt to come check it out. When she got to the window, she pushed her glasses up to the bridge of her nose. I pointed to the tree and said, "I think I see someone out there." She squinted her eyes and studied the tree for a moment, before throwing up her hands laughing. I was so confused. She looked down at her old leather watch and whispered to herself,
"Oh, silly me, it's that time."
She began to shuffle out of the room saying,
"The bicycle man is hungry."
I followed her into the back room. She then turned on a lamp that was next to an old torn black leather couch, where a pillow and blanket were laid out. Not only that, there were 2 half-empty glasses of water on the table. She picked the pillow up and fluffed it, then began straightening the blanket. As she did this, she began to tell me how,
"The bicycle man visits me every night. We have some dinner and coffee. Then I put him to bed. He then rides off in the mornings."
At this point, 8-year-old me was completely creeped out, and I began to feel my body tremble. I moved quietly back into the living room, crawling on my hands and knees, trying not to be seen from outside the window. I locked myself in a spare bedroom with my sister and pulled the house phone in with me. I desperately tried calling my mom, but unsurprisingly, she didn't pick up. I didn't know my dad's work number, and this was before he had a cell phone. We heard the man enter the house. He had a very deep voice and was coughing a lot. I don't remember exactly what he and my great aunt were talking about, but he used a lot of profanities and barked with laughter after she asked him a question. I distinctly remember him using the words, "bloodstains," but he kinda said it slowly, almost like he was singing it. My sister and I didn't come out for supper. We stayed there until it got dark out, and I made my sister share the bed with me as I lay awake, as still as I could, slowing my breathing so that I could hear whatever noise he might be making in any corner of the house. I don't know exactly what time it was, but I remember my heart skipping a beat when I heard heavy footsteps walking down the hall. They made their way to just outside our door. Then the doorknob started turning. I knew my aunt had a key to the room, and I remember praying that this strange man didn't know where to find it. After a moment of wrestling with a locked door, the man let out a mournful, almost disappointed cry, like the sound a kid would make after he dropped his ice cream cone. The footsteps walked back down the hall, and I stared at the door in terror, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember the sound of my mom moving around in the kitchen the next morning. As soon as I realized what time it was, I hauled ass into the kitchen and explained what happened. My mom looked really concerned, so she asked my great aunt about it, to which she gave her the same story that she had given me the night before. I told my mom about the makeshift bed in the back room too. We went to take a look at the couch. Another half-empty glass of water was on the nightstand, and the bedspread was messy, as if someone had slept there and left in a hurry. My mother flipped her shit, then called her friend at the sheriff's office about the stranger on the bicycle. A few days later, my mom got a call from her friend. They had picked up a guy on a bicycle who was trying to break into a house nearby. They found a knife, some rope, and several bags of biscuits on him. Apparently, he had been responsible for several break-ins in the area while he had been staying with my aunt. I tried to find some newspaper articles or anything online about the bicycle man, but I had no luck. My great aunt died a couple of years later. As for the bicycle man, I don't remember his name or what became of him. I barely remember what he looked like, but he gave me the worst night of my life. I'm a female, and at the time I was approximately 18-19 years old. My youngest brother was in 8th grade and was due to be confirmed at the end of the year. For those of you who are unaware of what that is, it's a ceremony performed in Catholic elementary schools that sort of confirms your faith and dedication to the religion before sending you off to high school. For this ceremony, the person being confirmed has to have a sponsor that is 18 years of age or older, and also has to be Catholic themselves. Thus, my brother chose me. Personally, I had moved on from Catholicism, as I did not agree with a lot of what I had learned, but I accepted my brother's request, as it was very important to him. Fast forward to the day in which my brother was being confirmed. As a sponsor, my role is significant but short-lived. From what I can recall, we simply placed our hands on our sponsor's shoulders, while they made their promise to God and the religion itself, and promised to support them on their journey. I may be missing a few details, but that's the basic gist of it. Thus, after our portion is complete, they request that we leave the stage and join the crowd to watch the remainder of the ceremony. Due to the fact that the church was quite packed, my family was standing along the back wall, so I walked off the stage and through the crowd to join them. There was not much left in the ceremony at this point, so it ended quite quickly. The students and priests began leaving the stage. They had to venture around the crowd, thus walked along the walls as opposed to going through the middle. That day I was wearing a blush-colored high-neck blouse, a black knee-length skirt, and gray nylons that had a black velvet rose pattern on it. As I mentioned, my family were up against the back wall of the church, preparing to move ourselves out of the way to make room for the students and priests that were making their way towards us. We congratulated them all as they passed, and began saying our hellos to the priests as they made their way towards us. However, the very last priest in the line, who looked to be about 80 years old, stopped dead in his tracks while in front of where I was standing. The priest then proceeded to slowly look me up and down, twice, with a very unnerving smile on his face. Following this, he leaned in and whispered the words, "I like your pantyhose." I was immediately set on edge. I moved in closer to my family as he continued to follow the line. After a few minutes, my mom turned to me and asked me if I was okay, as she saw the expression on my face. I advised her as to what just happened, and she was completely disgusted. My mother thought about saying something, but I advised her not to do so, as I didn't want to ruin my brother's day. She reluctantly agreed. As soon as we were able, we made our way out of the church and decided at that moment that we were never going back. I'm an uninteresting man in my late 20s with a stable job and a happy family. I never once entertained the notion that I might one day be the target of a stalker. So here's my story as a warning to everyone. You don't have to be a typical pretty young lady to catch the eye of a stalker. I don't know if this makes sense, but I am a habitual yet very casual Facebook user. I don't post a lot, but I do check my newsfeed often. One Saturday night, I was doing a quick round on Facebook before I went to bed when I received a friend request. I accepted it without hesitation. Just about every friend request I receive gets accepted because I don't ever post anything very personal. As I said, I have a very casual approach to social networking, I do a quick glance on the profile that had friended me and saw that it was obviously a fake account. Not thinking much about it, I put my computer away and fell asleep. The next day I was having lunch at a friend's house, having completely forgotten about the friend request from the night before. My phone buzzed and I saw I had gotten a message from a coworker of mine, Maya. Although Maya and I worked together and had a few mutual friends outside of work, we didn't communicate much other than when it was about work. I checked it, assuming it was work-related, and I guess, looking back, you can say it was. To get the gist of it, the Facebook account that friended me also friended Maya, and had bombarded her with insults and accusations of being a whore and a slut, and every other name in the book. The person took it a step further by messaging Maya's husband, saying that she was cheating on him with a coworker. Maya wanted to know if I knew who the person was. I explained to her how I accepted every friend request and had no idea who it was. I then proceeded to unfriend the profile in question. Maya explained to me that she already had suspicions on who it was and just wanted to see if I could confirm it. Let's rewind back a few weeks earlier. I had received a friend request from Carrie. It struck me as odd because although we worked at the same place, we never actually met, never spoken, or even made eye contact within 20 feet of each other. We worked in different departments, but I had to walk through her department to get to our lounge. That was the furthest extent of our interactions. I only learned her name when she friended me on Facebook and I recognized her picture. I'm not sure how she found out my name. Carrie also friended my wife's profile and subsequently started sifting through my wife's posts and photos, liking and commenting on several of them. She began interacting with my posts as well, as though we were good friends. At work though, I would still walk by as usual and still no interaction. I found it odd, but I didn't think much of it. The mysterious Facebook account continued to harass Maya until she told the person that she knew it was Carrie and was going to call the police. I thought that was the end of that, but I was very wrong. Over several weeks, I began getting more friend requests from girls looking to hook up with me. Obviously, I knew they were all fake, and for the most part, I ignored them. I also began getting notifications from my Google and Facebook accounts about suspicious activity on my profile. Most of the time, it warned me of failed login attempts. One I specifically remember said my Facebook account was actually logged in from somewhere unusual and asked me whether or not it was me. It wasn't me, and I should have been more concerned, but for some reason I didn't care, which was stupid, and even after that I didn't bother to change my password. At the time I viewed all these activities as random isolated incidents. I had no valuable information on my account, and didn't have any private secretive messages, so what harm could a potential hacker do? A few months passed when one day, my wife gets a message from Carrie stating that she had a high-end video camera and was looking to start some amateur filming. She wanted to know if we would help her by letting her film our family for a day. Remembering what Maya had said months ago, I was reluctant but wanted to give Carrie the benefit of the doubt, so we agreed to tell her that we would schedule a time for whenever we weren't busy, and left it at that. Once again, I have yet to actually meet Carrie. More weeks pass by and we completely forget about scheduling the film shoot with Carrie when she messages me about it. I apologize about forgetting about it, and turned her down when she asked to reschedule, suddenly feeling very uneasy about the whole thing. Then things got weird. She sent several gifs of stick figures doing sexually suggestive motions. I didn't respond, so she asked, "Funny, isn't it?" I immediately texted my wife to log into my Facebook profile to observe the messages. Not wanting to be rude, I agreed with Carrie as of the humor of the gifs, and carried on the conversation. She proceeded to send me old photos from my abandoned MySpace account that I had completely forgotten about. It was around this time when MySpace had been revamped, and people lost a lot of cherished memories. Somehow she dug mine up and decided to share them with me. Things escalated quickly from there. She began talking about her body and how she wasn't attractive, trying to bait me into complimenting her looks. She wasn't beautiful at all in the traditional sense, but she wasn't exactly hard to look at. I wasn't falling for it though. Then she hit me with something out of the blue. She asked me about my cock, and suggesting that it was probably really big. I decided that that was enough and stopped responding. Of course my wife was reading the whole time, and we were texting back and forth about how funny and weird this all was. I continued to go to work and still awkwardly never actually met her, I especially didn't want to strike up any conversations after that. Carrie messaged me one final time asking me for a favor. Maya had blocked her profile, and Carrie suspected that Maya was saying bad stuff about her, so she wanted me to check her profile to confirm. I told her that I wasn't going to spy on Maya for her, and that was that. Just between us though, I did check, and no, Maya couldn't care less to waste her time talking about Carrie. Around this time, my wife got a text from an unknown number. The person knew her name and was trying to remain anonymous, and was also trying to flirt with her. We were with a bunch of friends at the time, and we all thought it would be funny if we all text flirted with this person. Once again, I never thought to connect any of these occurrences. Carrie eventually quit work, and I continued to get suspicious activity that I stupidly continued to write off. I had pretty much forgotten all about Carrie. Then I would say over a year later, my wife drops a bomb on me. A good friend of ours started texting my wife, saying that I was sending very inappropriate messages on Facebook. I had been busy running errands all day and hadn't really checked my Facebook at the time. I found that my password had been changed, and when I finally logged back on, all my messages had been cleared. I had no idea the extent of what happened until I started hearing from more people that I was being very suggestive and nasty to them. The thing was, these were not random women on my friends list that were targeted. These were women that were close to me, good friends, my wife's sisters, and my friends' wives. These messages weren't holding back either. They went all out in graphic detail about what I wanted to do to them. I felt completely violated and humiliated. I couldn't imagine how the women felt. My wife and I were really close to our families and friends, and every other week or so, all of our friends would get together and drink, barbecue, watch movies or sports, and hang out. We've had several families over and never had a problem. All of them said they understood what happened, and that they knew it wasn't me. Deep inside though, I could see that they felt that it probably, potentially, possibly was me. Over time, more and more of them stopped coming over, to the point where my home started to feel empty. I confided in my wife about how I felt that they thought it was me, and she rebutted that I was being paranoid. She argued that our friends were just busy with their lives, and they would eventually come over again. I learned that someone had created a Facebook account using my name and picture, and continued harassing the same women. Some of them posted a picture of the conversations with me on Facebook. She commented that it really could be me, because that mystery person talked just like me, using the same vocabulary. She also stated that the person knew my friends and family extensively. My heart instantly shattered after reading that. I quit checking my Facebook for the longest time, and I guess I fell into a mild depression. I felt miserable. I told my wife that I wanted to disappear, and strongly considered quitting my job of 7 years and moving away to start over. I know now that I was being quite irrational, and thankfully my wife stayed strong for me through it all. I felt I needed to defend my honor, and started gathering alibis of times, people, and places I was around during the time of many of those messages. My wife brutally told me that she couldn't believe I was weak enough to let a no-life dumbass on Facebook put me down and make me feel that way. Which was true. I am and always have been a mentally strong person. I always look for the best in a bad situation. But for some reason this affected me differently. I can't explain why, but I felt extreme shame and guilt for something I didn't even do. Without my wife's support knocking me back to reality, I don't know what would have happened. We advised our friends to just ignore the person, and eventually everything stopped. From time to time I still get random friend requests, but I don't accept them anymore. I don't have any proof that this was all the work of Carrie. It just all happened during a time when she injected herself into my life. My friends have started coming over again, but it hasn't felt the same ever since. I don't know if it's them or just in my head. My wife and I came to the conclusion that Carrie reveled in the misery of others. After tormenting Maya, she moved on and targeted me, trying to ruin my marriage and distance me from my friends. And she did this for no reason other than the fact that she enjoyed doing it. I'm pretty sure she hasn't stopped and left me alone only because she found a new victim to harass. When I was 15 years old, I started a live journal account. At the time, a lot of my friends were also using the platform. It was basically early social networking, where people with similar interests would come together and read each other's blogs. I had only been posting for a short while when a guy began to comment on my entries. He said his name was John. It really should have made me more suspicious that there was a grown man trying to reach out to me through the internet. He claimed that he knew my friend Dale, who was 2 years older than me. We attended the same high school. I contacted Dale and asked him about John, to which he replied, "Oh yeah, John's awesome. We met on LiveJournal." He talked the guy up like he was super cool, and I should totally interact with him. John continued to leave comments on my journal frequently, but in addition to that, he began to email me. One of the first things he sent me was a screenshot of his computer desktop, where he had assembled a collage of pictures of me he had copied from my LiveJournal account, which made me super uncomfortable. I told Dale about it, but he just laughed it off, saying that John was just fucking with me. I decided to let it slide because I trusted Dale. After about a year of awkward emails from John, a woman named Jillian contacted me who claimed to be John's sister. There was some fucked up, convoluted story about how they weren't actually siblings, but they were raised together. I can't really remember all the details, but she began to send me extremely vicious messages, followed up almost immediately after by apology messages where she would talk to me like I was a puppy, saying cutesy shit like how darling and precious I was. After about a week, I began to suspect that Jillian didn't exist and was created by John to further harass me, or something to make himself look better. Shortly after that, John began sending me interracial porn and made extremely racist comments about them. That was enough for me, and I blocked both him and Jillian. In retrospect, it was right about then that I should have filed a police report. John eventually found a way to contact me with another email address. I'm not sure how. Maybe Dale told him. He tried to apologize for his behavior, but I just ignored him. I had had enough of this craziness. Around this time, Dale moved to another city with 2 of our mutual friends, one of whom I've kept contact with. He warned me that Dale and John started talking a lot on the phone, and he suspected that John was supplying Dale with pot because Dale had started smoking constantly. The idea that Dale and John were becoming so close made me very uneasy, because Dale knew my home address, phone number, and all kinds of other personal information. Shortly after, my discomfort was validated when I received an email from John stating that he was visiting my hometown soon and intended to swing by. I emailed him back and told him that if he ever contacted me again, that I would go straight to the police and press charges against him for harassment, as I had saved every email I ever got from him or Jillian. Shortly after, I received a call from Dale's roommate, who told me that Dale had received a call from John, who was enraged after I had sent him that email. I decided that I had to cut Dale out of my life as well. He had become untrustworthy and was letting his own life fall apart. All he ever did was smoke pot and play video games, mooching off his roommates and other friends for money and food. After a few months, his roommates kicked him out after an incident occurred at their apartment where someone had tried to break down the door looking for Dale, who owed him money. Apparently having nowhere else to go, Dale moved in with John, who turned out to be a 50-something-year-old trucker who didn't have a sister named Jillian. And it turned out that John wasn't even his real name. As far as I know, they're still living together. To this day, I still have no idea what motivated John to keep contacting me. I just know I dodged a bullet. Had I been more receptive or less cautious, he may have drawn me into his web of drugs and lies, and ruined my future. Sometimes I do feel bad for Dale, but honestly it's his own dumbass fault. But I do hope that he someday turns his life around. I know John and I never officially met, but as far as online communications go, I hope I never encounter this deranged man again.
There's always a reason to be afraid.